The library door stands half open. Tessa sees the light before she sees him. It is not the soft glow from the fire or the lamps. This light is thin, cold, and moving beneath a man's skin like trapped moonlight. Her hand tightens on the brass handle. Lucian Vale stands near the far wall with one hand pressed against a shelf of old books. A lamp lies shattered at his feet. Rain hits the tall windows. Glass shines on the floor. The fire burns low behind him. Then he turns. Tessa stops breathing. His eyes are no longer grey. They shine silver, hard and bright, like winter light on deep water. A narrow line of pale light pulses at his throat, fading and returning as if something inside him is fighting to break free. The room feels charged, not loud, not wild, wrong in a quiet way that freezes her where she stands. Lucian looks at her with tired dread, not rage, like he has seen this moment before, like he already knows what fear usually makes people do. "This is the part where you leave," he says softly. Tessa did not come to Vale House chasing mystery. She came because real life had cornered her. 3 nights earlier, she sat at her small kitchen table with her late mother's bookstore ledger open, rent overdue, sales falling, and one message from her younger brother asking if school fees would still be covered next month. She had stared at the numbers until they lost all shape. The job offer arrived after midnight, polished, urgent, and strange, yet the amount promised in 30 days looked like breath after weeks underwater. That was why she said yes. Not for adventure, not for a handsome stranger in a cliffside estate, not for silver eyes and locked doors. She came for the store with its worn wooden shelves, for the bell above the door her mother once loved, for the future Nolan still believed was waiting for him. She came because tired people do bold things when survival leaves them few clean choices. So, standing in that library, fear gripping her throat, Tessa understood the trap. If she ran now, she would be leaving behind far more than a job. If you love emotional mystery stories with romance, secrets, and life lessons that stay with you, like and subscribe to Romance Tales with Mr. Kingsley, because this story gets deeper with every moment. Lucian's fingers slip against the shelf. It happens in one small movement, but Tessa catches it at once. The strength leaves his posture first, then his shoulders tilt, and suddenly the impossible man in front of her looks less like a threat, and more like someone losing a fight he has been hiding for too long. His breath catches, then his knees give way. Tessa moves before fear can stop her. She crosses the room in 2 quick steps and catches his arm. The moment her hand closes around him, cold shocks her skin. Then warmth rushes through just as fast, deep and strange, like heat trapped under ice. The silver at his throat flickers. Lucian stares at her hand with open disbelief. Not anger, not warning. Disbelief. Behind her, Maeve stops short. "You should not have done that." Tessa barely hears her. Lucian's weight leans into her for one unsteady second, and the room feels as if it has gone still around them. The silver in his eyes begins to dim at the center, grey pushing back through. "You touched him," Maeve says, lower now, almost stunned. Tessa looks up at Lucian. He looks shaken in a way that has nothing to do with weakness, as if her touch changed something neither of them understands yet. Lucian steadies himself and slowly pulls away, though his eyes stay fixed on Tessa, as if she has crossed into a place no one else was ever meant to reach. The silver is fading now, but not fully gone. That strange light still moves at his throat, rising and dimming like a secret fighting to stay hidden. He looks exhausted. "Tessa," he says, his voice rougher than before, "if you want the car called, it will be here in 10 minutes. You will still be paid." The offer should comfort her. Full pay, a clean exit. No questions forced, no danger chased. She should take it, and never look back. Maeve says nothing. She only watches Tessa with the kind of silence that feels like a test. Tessa's pulse pounds hard enough to hurt. Every warning in her body tells her to leave this house, this room, this man whose eyes changed color in front of her. Yet one thought rises above the fear. If she walks away now, she will leave with money, but never with truth. She looks at Lucian, at the strain in his face, at the sadness beneath his calm, and hears herself ask the one question she knows she should not ask. "What are you?" The fire cracks in the silence. Lucien closes his eyes for 1 second, as if that question carries a cost of its own. For a moment, Lucien does not answer. He stands in the firelight with broken glass near his shoes, rain striking the windows, and that last trace of silver still caught in his eyes. The room feels suspended, as if even the house is waiting to hear what he will say. Maeve bends and lifts the fallen lamp with steady hands, but her gaze never leaves Tessa. "It is late," she says quietly. "This conversation can wait until morning." Lucien finally looks at Tessa again, not past her, not through her, at her. "If you stay until morning," he says, each word measured, "I will tell you what I can. What I can, not everything, not yet. Still, it is more than denial, more than escape, more than the silence she expected. Tessa should leave. She knows it. 10 minutes from now, a car could carry her away from the cliff, the house, and the man whose very presence has torn apart everything she thought was possible. But when she looks at Lucien, she does not see a monster. She sees pain, restraint, and the tired certainty of someone already expecting rejection. So she makes the choice that changes everything. "I'll stay," she says. And before dawn comes, Tessa Monroe will learn that the truth inside Vale House is far stranger and far more human than fear first allowed her to believe. At 1:14 in the morning, Tessa Monroe sat alone at her kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and a screen full of jobs she did not trust. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tapping of rain against the window above the sink. She had been searching for hours, moving from one listing to another, each one sounding worse than the last. Temporary assistant, night nurse, private house manager, elder care support. Most offered too little money. Some asked for too much. A few looked polished enough to fool desperate people, which made them the most dangerous kind. Her eyes burned. Her shoulders ached. Still, she kept scrolling because stopping would mean facing the numbers on the table beside her. Then, a new email appeared. Private, live-in caregiver needed for 30 days. Excellent pay. Quiet estate. Discretion required. Start immediately. Tessa sat up. The sender was listed as Vale House Personnel Office. The message itself was short, neat, and strangely formal. No long sales pitch. No awkward spelling. No desperate tone. It included an address on the northern coast, a start date set for the next day, and a salary so high she read it 3 times before trusting her own eyes. 30 days for that amount? Her first thought was simple. No. Her second thought came slower. What if this was the answer she had been begging life to send before things got worse? She clicked the message open again and studied every line. The language was careful. The instructions were direct. A driver would collect the selected candidate. Room and meals would be provided. Full discretion was expected. References would be checked immediately. The employer valued calm, routine, and privacy above all else. Privacy above all else. Tessa leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. There it was, the part that should have warned her away, the part that made the whole thing feel strange enough to close and forget. Yet her eyes stayed fixed on the number at the bottom of the message. 30 days. Enough money to stop the ground from giving way beneath her life. On the table beside her laptop sat the real reason she kept reading. A stack of overdue bills leaned against the small tin box where her mother used to keep loose cash for the bookstore register. The lease notice sat on top, folded once, though Tessa already knew every word inside it. Past due, final reminder, payment required to avoid further action. Even without opening it, she could feel the pressure of it like a hand at her throat. Next to the papers stood a framed photo of her mother behind the front counter of Monroe Books, smiling with a softness that used to make strangers stay longer than they planned. Her sweater sleeves were rolled up. A pencil rested behind one ear. She looked tired in the photo, but proud too. Like the cramped little shop with its slanted shelves and second-hand paperbacks was still something worth holding on to. To Tessa, it was the last place in the world that still felt like home. After her mother passed, the store had become less of a business and more of a promise. Tessa had promised herself she would keep it open. She would protect it. She would not let years of love and work vanish under rent notices and unpaid invoices. But promises made in grief often run straight into money, and money never cares how much a place means. Her phone lit up on the table. Nolan. A message, not a call. You still up? She stared at it a moment before opening the rest. Got my college payment reminder tonight. No pressure. Just checking in. That was Nolan. Even when worried, he still tried to protect her from the weight of his own needs. He was 19, smart, hopeful, and too good at pretending things would work out on their own. Tessa had spent the last 2 years filling every gap she could find. Extra care shifts, online tutoring, weekend inventory work for a pharmacy 2 streets over. She kept saying yes to work because no one else was going to save them. She looked back at the email. It was strange. It was rushed. It asked for trust before giving any. Still, the truth sitting on her kitchen table looked far more frightening than the message on her screen. Tessa reached for her tea, took a sip, and regretted it at once. It had gone bitter and cold. She set it down and read the email again, slower this time, hunting for the flaw that would make the choice easy. There had to be one. A false website, a missing company record, a copied address, some clear sign that no careful person would step into this arrangement. She searched the estate name first, Vale House. The search results were thin. A few old property records. One coastal preservation article that mentioned a privately owned cliffside estate, held by a long-established family. A business note tied to charitable donations made through a holding group under the name Lucian Vale, school repairs, food bank support, flood relief funds. No interviews, no society pages, no social photos, no polished public image. That should have made her feel safer. Instead, it made the man behind the email feel harder to read. She searched the address next. Real. Remote. 2 hours north of Portland. Photos from a mapping site showed trees, road, gates, and the edge of the sea beyond them. No nearby neighbors. No small town clustered close enough for comfort. Just coastline, pines, and stone. Too isolated. Her eyes moved back to the job terms. Live in, immediate start. Strict discretion. Every red flag stood up at once. Tessa pressed both palms to the table. She knew what caution looked like. She worked with fragile people. She had spent enough nights in hospital rooms and private homes to understand how quickly strange situations turned unsafe. If one of her friends had shown her this email, she would have said no without hesitation. But caution did not pay a lease. Suspicion did not cover tuition. Good instincts did not keep a bookstore alive. The hard truth was sitting in plain view. She had run out of gentle choices. She rubbed at the ache between her brows and thought about her mother's last winter, how the older woman still smiled for customers while sorting overdue supplier invoices in the back office. She thought about Nolan acting cheerful at dinner, while quietly checking scholarship sites on his phone. She thought about herself smiling through care shifts, promising everyone around her that things would steady soon. Fear had protected her many times. Tonight, fear offered nothing. At 1:58, Tessa opened the email again and moved her cursor over the reply button. She stopped. Questions crowded her mind all at once. What kind of man needed a live-in caregiver, yet offered no medical details? Why 30 days exactly? Why the demand for privacy? Why hire in such a rush? Why did the whole arrangement feel less like a normal job and more like an invitation into something she could not name? She typed one line. I am interested, but I would like more information about the role before confirming. Then she deleted it. Too cautious. If the offer was real, hesitation might push it to the next applicant. If it was false, asking questions might not protect her anyway. She hated that both options felt true. At 2:03, another message arrived. If available, reply tonight. Transportation will be arranged. Delay is difficult. Tessa stared at the sentence. Delay is difficult. It sounded formal, but beneath it sat urgency sharp enough to tighten her chest. Whoever sent it wanted an answer now. She opened a blank reply and typed 3 words. I can start She erased them. Then she stood, crossed the apartment, and looked out at the wet street below. A taxi rolled past. A shop sign flickered at the corner. Somewhere in another building, a child cried and then settled. Normal city sounds, familiar things, safe things. Yet safety had done little for her lately except give her a front-row seat to slow collapse. When she sat back down, she saw the time in the corner of the screen. 2:06 a.m. She typed her full response in one clean motion. I am available. My references are attached. Please confirm details. Her finger hovered over send for one last second. Then she pressed it. The email vanished from the draft folder and flew into the dark, toward a stranger named Lucian Vale. Tessa leaned back, heart beating too hard for a simple job reply, and whispered the question no screen could answer. What kind of man hires someone overnight to live with him for 30 days in a silent house by the sea? Tessa did not sleep much after that. She lay in bed fully aware of every sound in the apartment, every passing car, every shift of rain at the window. Sometime after 3, she checked her inbox again. Nothing. At 4, still nothing. Near 6, exhaustion pulled her under for less than an hour before her phone vibrated across the nightstand. Confirmation. She sat up at once. The message was brief and precise. Candidate accepted. Pick up at 11:30. Pack for 30 days. Formal clothing not required. Personal vehicle unnecessary. Meals and room provided. Arrival expected by afternoon. Below that sat one final line. Thank you for your discretion. No interview, no call, no long exchange. Just acceptance. Tessa read the message twice, then rose before fear had time to grow roots. She showered, dressed, packed practical clothes, a notebook, 2 novels, her charger, and the framed photo of her mother that normally stayed by her bed. She left the bills stacked neatly under a paperweight on the kitchen table, as though order alone could hold them back for one more month. At 9, Nolan called. You sound strange, he said, after she told him she had picked up a temporary live-in care job. I barely slept. Do you know these people? Not yet. A pause. Tess. The concern in his voice nearly undid her. She forced steadiness into hers. It's 30 days. Good pay. I need to do this. Another pause. Softer now. Then text me when you get there. I will. By 11:28, she stood outside her building with one suitcase at her feet and the damp spring air pressing cool against her skin. The city looked ordinary enough to mock her nerves. Delivery bikes, dog walkers, a woman carrying tulips passed the bakery on the corner. Then, a long black car turned onto the street and stopped in front of her. The driver stepped out, spoke her name, and took her suitcase without wasting a word. Tessa glanced once at the apartment window above her. Then she got in. As the car pulled away from the curb and headed north, the city began to fall behind. And with every mile, the job she had accepted felt less like work and more like the first step into a life she did not yet understand. The drive north felt longer than the map had promised. For the first hour, Tessa kept her eyes on familiar things. Gas stations, narrow storefronts, traffic lights, tired apartment blocks, people carrying shopping bags through wet sidewalks. She wanted to hold on to something ordinary for as long as possible. But little by little, the city thinned. Buildings gave way to stretches of road, lined with dark pines. The air outside the glass seemed colder. The sky lowered into a flat grey sheet, and the sea began to appear in flashes between the trees, distant at first, then closer, harder, louder. The driver barely spoke. He answered only when needed, and even then his voice stayed polite and short. Tessa asked once, how much farther? He checked the mirror and said, about 30 minutes, miss. After that, silence returned, and stayed. She looked down at her phone. 2 bars. Then 1, then none. That unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. By the time the road curved higher along the cliffs, the rain had softened into mist. It blurred the edges of everything. Pine branches bent over the road like they were trying to keep watch. Below them, waves struck the rocks in white bursts that vanished almost as fast as they appeared. Then the gates came into view. Tall black iron, stone pillars on both sides. No sign with a family name. No warm entrance lights. Only a narrow security box built into the wall and a camera above the left pillar, fixed on the car as it rolled to a stop. The gates opened without a sound. Tessa sat straighter. Beyond them, the estate stretched ahead through drifting fog. A long gravel drive, clipped hedges, bare trees, and at the far end, a house so dark and still it seemed to rise from the cliff itself. Vale House was built of old stone, high windows, and steep slate roofs. It did not look welcoming. It looked permanent. The car slowed near the front steps. Tessa stared at the place and felt the same thought settle into her chest with quiet force. This was not a house where people simply lived. It was a house where secrets had room to grow. Tessa stepped out of the car with her suitcase in one hand and a steady face she did not fully feel. The air near the cliff bit through her coat at once, cool and damp, carrying the sharp scent of salt, wet stone, and pine. Up close, Vale House felt even larger than it had from the drive. The windows rose high and dark above her, not empty, but unreadable. Nothing about the place said comfort. Nothing about it said danger either. It sat in a stranger category, something colder than welcome and quieter than threat. The driver placed her suitcase at the foot of the steps, gave a brief nod, and returned to the car as if his part in her arrival had ended the moment her shoes touched the gravel. Tessa watched him go, and felt a small wave of isolation she tried not to show. The gates were far behind her now. The road was hidden by trees and mist. There was no neighbor's porch light in sight, no cafe across the street, no passing voices from nearby homes. Just the wide front steps, the heavy door ahead, and the sea crashing somewhere below the cliff. For the first time since sending that email, she felt the true size of what she had done. She was alone, in a place she did not know, about to enter the home of a man she had never met, for a job that still carried more questions than facts. Yet even with that thought pressing in, another feeling rose beside it, one she understood too well. This was how hard choices often arrived, not dressed as certainty, not wrapped in comfort. They came wearing risk, silence, and the thin hope that enduring one difficult month might rescue the rest of the year. Tessa tightened her grip on the suitcase handle and glanced once at the framed photo tucked safely in her bag. Her mother had built a whole life on faith, paperbacks, and stubborn love. Tessa had inherited more of that than she sometimes admitted, so she drew one slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and climbed the steps, telling herself what she had been telling herself for months. This is still a job. You still need the money. You can do hard things. The front door opened before Tessa could knock. An older woman stood there in a deep green dress with silver hair swept neatly away from her face. She carried herself with the calm of someone who had spent years holding a difficult place together without ever needing to raise her voice. Her eyes moved over Tessa once. Suitcase, coat, tired expression, then settled with quiet approval. "You made good time," she said. Tessa let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I almost turned around twice." The woman gave the faintest smile. "Most do. I'm Maeve Holloway. Come in." The warmth inside the house hit Tessa first. Not cozy warmth, but controlled warmth, as if every room had been kept at the exact temperature someone preferred. The air smelled of cedar, old books, polished wood, and rain carried in from open doors. No flowers, no cooking, no sign of everyday mess. The entry hall stretched wide and high, with a curved staircase on one side and a long corridor lined with antique mirrors on the other. Maeve led her into a small sitting room where a folder waited on the table. "Your duties are simple," Maeve said. "Mr. Vale values routine. He dislikes fuss. Meals are prepared. Medication is handled privately. Your role is observation, presence, and company." "Company?" Tessa asked. "Yes. That sounds unusual for a caregiver contract." "So is he." Maeve opened the folder and slid a sheet of paper toward her. "There are house rules." Tessa scanned the page, then looked up. "Do not enter the West Tower after dark. Keep the balcony doors locked at night. Do not invite anyone onto the grounds. If you hear raised voices in the lower level, do not go down. If Mr. Vale asks you to leave during one of his episodes, stay where you are, unless I tell you otherwise." Tessa lowered the page slowly. Episodes. Maeve held her gaze. You agreed to discretion. That is not the same as blindness. No, Maeve said. It is not. The answer settled heavily in the room. Tessa looked back at the list and felt the first deep shift inside her. This was no ordinary house, and whatever waited ahead was already shaping the rules before she had even met the man who wrote them. Before Tessa could press Maeve for more, the sitting room door opened. The man who stepped inside did not look like anyone who needed care. Lucian Vale moved with the kind of quiet control that made the whole room seem to adjust around him. He was tall, pale, and sharply put together in a black sweater and dark trousers, with the sort of stillness that did not read as shyness or weakness. It read as discipline. His face was striking in a severe way, but what unsettled Tessa first was not his looks. It was the calm, not warm calm, not relaxed calm, the kind that felt practiced. Miss Monroe, he said. His voice was low and smooth, with no sign of illness, strain, or age beyond the weight in it. Tessa is fine, she replied. His eyes stayed on her a moment longer than politeness required, as if he were measuring more than her words. Thank you for coming. Tessa waited for a limp, a tremor, a brace, a sign that would make sense of the job she had accepted. She found none. He stood there, looking more like the owner of the house than a man in need of help. You do not look like someone who needs a caregiver, she said. Maeve inhaled softly, though she said nothing. Lucian did not seem offended. You do not look like someone who ignores obvious questions. Then let me ask one. He tilted his head once. Go on. What happened to you? For the first time, a crack appeared in his expression. Small, but real. Not anger, not shock. Something older, something closer to memory. I got through something alone, he said. Poorly. It was not a real answer. It was the shape of one, enough to admit pain, not enough to explain it. Tessa studied him in the silence that followed. The folder of rules still lay open on the table beside her. The list of warnings, the talk of episodes, the locked tower, the strange demand for privacy. Now this man stood before her, looking strong enough to carry his own storms. So, the question sharpened inside her. If Lucian Vale was not weak, not bedridden, not visibly broken, then what kind of man hires a stranger to stay inside his house for 30 days and simply watch him live? Dinner was served before sunset in a smaller room off the west side of the house, one lined with dark wood panels and tall windows that faced the sea. By then, Tessa had unpacked just enough to feel slightly settled, changed into a dry sweater, and reminded herself at least 6 times that this was still work. Even so, the house had not grown easier in her mind. If anything, the quiet had become more noticeable. No television from another room, no music drifting through hallways, no casual sounds of a normal household moving through evening, only footsteps when they mattered, voices when necessary, and the steady, far-off strike of waves below the cliff. Lucian sat across from her at the small dining table with the same calm he had worn in the sitting room. Candlelight touched one side of his face, leaving the other in softer shadow. Maeve served soup, bread, and tea for Tessa, then placed a dark glass near Lucian's hand before leaving without a word. He did not touch the bread. He did not reach for the soup. He only lifted the glass once, then set it down. That detail stayed with her. He asked about the drive, about Portland, about her mother's bookstore, about Nolan. He listened closely, never interrupting, and remembered every small thing she said. When she mentioned Nolan's habit of leaving every kitchen cabinet open, Lucian gave the faintest smile, like the image landed somewhere personal. You talk like you know what family noise sounds like, Tessa said. His gaze shifted toward the window for a brief second. I used to. The words settled awkwardly between them. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed rain hard against the glass. One candle trembled. Tessa looked past Lucian toward the antique mirror on the wall, and froze. The mirror held the table, the candles, her shoulder, the room behind them. But where Lucian should have been, there was only darkness. She blinked once, then again, before she could decide whether exhaustion was playing games with her. Something heavy crashed somewhere deep in the house. Lucian's eyes lifted at once, and upstairs, in the room prepared for her, Tessa would soon learn that sleep was not coming easily to Vale House. Tessa did not sleep at once after dinner. She tried. She changed into a long cotton sleep shirt, pulled the curtains halfway across the tall bedroom windows, and sat on the edge of the bed telling herself she was only tired, only unsettled, only adjusting to a strange place and a stranger routine. The room itself was beautiful in a restrained way: cream walls, dark furniture, a reading chair by the window, and a carved wooden wardrobe that looked older than her entire apartment building. Yet none of it softened the feeling that the house was watching its own silence too closely. What stayed with her most was Lucien. Not because he had been rude. He had not. Not because he had been cold in the usual sense. He had listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and spoken with a measured calm most people would have called polished. Still, something about him sat wrong in her mind. Not loud enough to name, not sharp enough to prove, but steady enough to remain. It was the way he seemed to arrive rather than enter, as if rooms adjusted themselves before he took a step. It was the way his voice never rose, yet still carried weight. It was the way he held eye contact just long enough to make her feel seen, then withdrew before the moment became easy. It was also the strange fact that he looked too composed for a man surrounded by rules, privacy, and talk of episodes. Most patients she had cared for revealed their fragility quickly. In the hands, in the breath, in the shoulders, in the tiny signs the body gave away when life had pressed too hard on it. Lucien showed none of that. If anything, he gave the impression of a man holding himself together with more strength than comfort. That was what unsettled her. He did not feel weak. He did not feel helpless. He felt contained. And Tessa had already begun to suspect that whatever Vale House was keeping from her, Lucien Vale was carrying the heaviest part of it behind a face so calm it almost looked practiced. Tessa lay back against the pillows. Yet rest would not come. The house was too still for that. She had spent the last 2 years stepping through other people's lives as a caregiver, and she knew the sound of ordinary homes. Even expensive homes had habits: water running through pipes, a television left on in another room, a late phone call, laughter from a kitchen, a door closing with no thought behind it. Vale House had none of that. Its silence felt chosen, guarded, like every wall knew more than it would ever say. She turned onto her side and looked toward the rain-dark window. In the weak light from the bedside lamp, her suitcase stood near the wardrobe, half unpacked, practical and plain against the room's old-world elegance. Everything about the place reminded her that she had stepped far outside her life. Back in Portland, the apartment above the bookstore groaned in winter and trapped heat in summer. Nolan left mugs in the sink and forgot to fold blankets. The floor near the kitchen always creaked. Nothing in her world was polished enough to hide itself. That thought brought her back to Lucien. He did not feel like the men she had worked for before, wealthy, impatient, eager to stay in control even when illness had stripped them of comfort. He did not feel like someone trying to impress her either. If anything, he seemed to be holding a careful distance while still paying more attention than he should. He remembered details too easily. He listened as if small facts mattered. When she spoke about Nolan, his expression shifted in a way that looked almost familiar, almost tender, then vanished before she could trust it. That brief smile at dinner stayed with her as well. Not because it was charming. It was too restrained for that. It stayed with her because it made him seem for 1 second less like the owner of a cliffside estate and more like a man who once belonged to a louder, warmer life. That was the part she related to most. Not the money, not the house, not the mystery, the loneliness. Because Tessa knew what it meant to keep moving through a room as if nothing inside you was falling quiet. When Tessa closed her eyes, dinner replayed in sharp pieces. Lucien lifting the dark glass, but never touching the bread. Lucien asking about her drive, then about the bookstore, then Nolan, as if he preferred facts that belonged to real lives over safe small talk. Lucien sitting perfectly within reach of candlelight, yet never seeming fully warmed by it. She sat up in bed again, restless now. The detail that bothered her most was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost ordinary, which made it worse. He had eaten nothing, not slowly, not sparingly, not at all. Most people would have missed it in the flow of conversation. Tessa had not. Caregiving trained her to notice what others ignored. appetite, timing, breath, the way a person reached for a cup, the way their shoulders carried fatigue. Lucien's habits did not read as random. They read as deliberate. She tried to explain it away. Maybe he had eaten earlier. Maybe his condition came with dietary restrictions Maeve had chosen not to discuss. Maybe he disliked eating in front of strangers. All possible, none satisfying. Then there was the mirror. She could still see it clearly in her mind. The old glass reflecting the room, the candle flames, the table, her own shoulder, the rain at the window. But not him, or rather, not all of him. Just a blank darkness where his form should have been, as if the mirror had refused to complete the scene. Exhaustion, she told herself again. Yet even that excuse was weakening, because this house had rules too strange for coincidence. A locked west tower, closed balcony doors, talk of episodes, privacy treated like law. Now a man who ate nothing, smiled too rarely, listened too closely, and failed to appear properly in the mirror. Tessa swung her feet to the floor and reached for the glass of water Maeve had left on the bedside table. Her hand paused halfway there. Somewhere below, deep in the house, something heavy struck the floor. She went still. A second sound followed, sharper this time. Glass. And suddenly, the silence of Vale House no longer felt empty. It felt like something had finally broken through it. Tessa set the glass down without taking a sip. For a few seconds, she stayed exactly where she was, sitting at the edge of the bed with every nerve turned toward the floor beneath her. The house gave nothing back at first. No footsteps, no voices, only the rain tapping the window and the dull rush of blood in her ears. Then it came again. A low sound this time, rough and strained, not loud enough to be called a cry, yet too human to mistake for the wind. Tessa stood. Maeve's rules rushed back at once. If you hear raised voices in the lower level, do not go down. If Mr. Vale asks you to leave during one of his episodes, stay where you are unless I tell you otherwise. Episodes. She stared at the bedroom door. Common sense told her to stay put. She barely knew these people. She had been inside the house for less than a day. Whatever was happening downstairs belonged to them, not to her. Yet that thought lasted only a moment before another pushed against it. What kind of caregiver stays in bed while someone struggles alone only a floor below? She pulled on the robe hanging near the wardrobe and tied it quickly at the waist. The hallway outside was dim, lit by wall lamps that cast soft pools of gold across the runner carpet. Everything looked orderly, untouched, almost calm enough to make her doubt what she had heard. Then another sharp crack split the silence. Glass again. This time, there was no talking herself out of it. Tessa moved toward the staircase, her bare feet silent against the carpet. Halfway there, she stopped and listened. The sound had come from the west side of the house, not the lower level. She realized, somewhere nearer, somewhere on this floor or just below it. A thin line of light showed beneath a door at the far end of the corridor, the library she had passed earlier with shelves visible through the glass paneling. A shadow moved across that light. Her throat tightened. Because now, the question standing in front of her was no longer simple. Was Lucien Vale sick? Was he dangerous? Or was he something far harder to explain? Tessa moved toward the light at the end of the corridor, one careful step at a time. The hallway seemed longer now than it had earlier. The silence tighter, the air cooler against her skin. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows to her right. And somewhere below, the sea struck the rocks with a deep, distant force that made the whole house feel anchored to something older than stone. She kept her eyes on the thin line of light beneath the library door. Then a voice came from behind her. Tessa. Maeve. Calm, low, firm. Tessa turned. Maeve stood halfway down the corridor, one hand resting lightly against the wall, her expression composed but unreadable. You heard it too, Tessa whispered. Yes. Is he hurt? Maeve did not answer at once. That silence told Tessa more than any quick reassurance could have. Go back to your room, Maeve said. Another sound came from inside the library. Not glass this time. A rough breath. Then Lucien's voice, strained in a way she had not heard before, as if each word had to push through pain. Do not send her away. Tessa felt something shift inside her at once. Not courage, exactly. Something more stubborn. Something that hated the idea of walking away while someone inside that room was barely holding himself together. Maeve studied her face for one long second. "If you step through that door," she said quietly, "you will not be able to pretend this is an ordinary job anymore." Tessa looked back at the line of light. That warning should have stopped her. Instead, it made the truth feel closer. She drew a slow breath and moved past Maeve before fear had time to take command. Her fingers closed around the library handle. Cold metal, steady hand, loud heartbeat. She pushed the door open, and in the firelit room beyond, with shattered glass on the floor and Lucian Vale standing near the shelves like a man fighting his own body, Tessa Monroe was about to see the one thing that would make leaving impossible. The library looked different at night. What had seemed elegant earlier now felt sealed off from the rest of the house, as if the room had been waiting for darkness to become itself. The fire had burned low in the grate, leaving behind a deep red glow that barely reached the tall shelves. One lamp lay broken on the floor, its shade torn, its glass scattered across the rug and polished wood. Rain struck the windows in restless bursts, and each sound seemed to vanish into the strange stillness gathered inside the room. Lucian stood near the far wall with one hand braced against a bookcase. For one suspended second, Tessa forgot how to move. He was no longer only the calm man from dinner, no longer the quiet employer who spoke in measured tones and listened too closely. Something in him had shifted beyond explanation. His head was slightly bowed, his shoulders rigid, his fingers curled so tightly against the wood that the tendons in his hands stood out pale against his skin. Then he lifted his face. Tessa froze. His eyes were silver. Not grey touched by light, not a trick of shadow. Silver in the clearest, coldest sense, bright and sharp like moonlight hitting water in the dead of night. The colour did not soften him. It changed him. It made him look less like a man caught in pain, and more like a man holding back something far stronger than pain. A faint line of light moved beneath the skin at his throat. It pulsed once, then again, thin and cold, like something alive running under the surface. The sight sent a chill through Tessa, so sudden she felt it in her teeth. The room itself seemed charged around him. Not loud, not wild, heavy, as if the air had tightened and drawn inward. Lucian turned fully toward her. His expression changed the moment he saw her face. Not with anger, not with surprise, with recognition, like he knew exactly what she had seen. Like he knew exactly what fear usually did next. "There it is," he said softly, his voice rough with strain. "The part where you leave." Every instinct in Tessa's body told her to turn around. Leave the room. Walk back into the corridor. Let Maeve handle whatever this was. Get through the night. Take the money offered, and disappear before dawn made any of it feel more real. She had enough trouble in her life without adding a man with silver eyes and strange light under his skin to the list. Yet fear was not the only thing she felt, because for all the shock in front of her, Lucian did not look like a man about to hurt someone. He looked like a man fighting not to. His breathing was uneven. His shoulders were locked too tight. His face held strain, but beneath it sat something worse. Shame. Not the shame of being caught in a lie. The shame of being seen in a state he had spent too long trying to hide. That struck her harder than she expected. Tessa knew that look. Not in this form, not with impossible eyes, or a room that felt one breath away from breaking, but in the human ways pain often showed itself. She had seen it in patients who hated being helped to the bathroom, in proud men embarrassed by trembling hands, in women who apologized for needing help after surgery, in her mother, on the bad days near the end when standing behind. The bookstore counter cost more than she admitted. There was a certain kind of suffering that hurt most when another person witnessed it. Lucian wore that same hurt now. Maeve remained near the door behind Tessa, silent, alert, giving nothing away. The fire snapped once. Rain streaked the glass. Tessa became aware of her own pulse, fast and loud, but beneath it, another thought was taking shape. This man had expected her to run before she had even moved. That meant others had, maybe all of them. And standing there in the doorway with fear gripping one side of her, and pity rising on the other. Tessa realized the moment had changed. This was no longer only about what Lucien was. It was about what he had been forced to endure alone. Lucien's hand slipped against the shelf. It was only a small movement, easy to miss if Tessa had not already fixed every part of her attention on him. Yet the second it happened, the whole image in front of her changed. Until then, he had looked frightening because he seemed powerful. Now he looked frightening because power was no longer the same thing as control. His chest rose once, too sharply. The line of pale light at his throat flared brighter. Then his knees gave way. Tessa moved before thought could stop her. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps and caught his arm just as his weight began to fall. The contact shocked her. His skin was cold first, so cold it felt wrong against her hand. Then a rush of heat followed beneath it, sudden and deep, as if warmth had been trapped under stone and broken loose at her touch. Lucien stared at her hand on his sleeve, not at her face, not at the floor, at her hand. His expression held raw disbelief. Behind her, Maeve stopped so abruptly that the hem of her dress brushed broken glass. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice lower now, no longer calm in the same careful way as before. Tessa barely heard her. Lucien's weight leaned into her for one unsteady second, and she felt the strain in him, the rigid effort, the battle happening under his skin. He was not weak. He was resisting something, holding something back, with the last clean thread of his strength. His eyes stayed on hers. The silver had not vanished, but it flickered now. Grey began pressing back through the center, slow and uncertain, like daylight returning after a hard storm. His breathing remained uneven. So did hers. Maeve stepped closer, watching them both. "Miss Monroe," she said, sharper this time, "step away." But Tessa did not move at once, because in that impossible, breathless moment, one truth rose above all the fear in her body. Her touch had changed something, and whatever Lucien Vale had become, he had not expected her to be the one thing that could still reach him. Lucien steadied himself with visible effort and slowly pulled away from Tessa's hold, though not by much. It was clear he wanted distance, yet something in him still seemed tied to the place where her hand had touched his arm. His breathing remained rough. The pale light beneath his skin had dimmed, though it had not vanished. It moved faintly at his throat, like the last trace of a storm refusing to leave the sky. He lifted his head and looked at her fully. "Tessa," he said, his voice lower now, worn at the edges. "If you want the car called, it will be here in 10 minutes. You will still be paid." The words struck her harder than she expected. He was giving her a way out. Clean, immediate. No questions forced on her. No pressure. No attempt to explain away what she had just seen. He was not asking for trust. He was offering escape. Maeve stood a few feet away, silent and watchful, as if she already knew how this scene usually ended. The room held its breath around them. Rain moved against the glass. Firelight trembled over broken pieces of lamp on the floor. Tessa could hear her own pulse in the silence. She should have taken the offer. Everything in her life before tonight would have told her to leave. Strange house, hidden rules, a man whose eyes changed before her, a touch that seemed to do what no medicine in the room had done. Every warning sign stood in front of her clearly now, and none of them looked small. Yet the strongest thing she felt was no longer fear. It was the question he had left sitting between them. What had happened to you? He had answered it before with only a shadow of truth. Now she had seen enough to know the real answer was far beyond illness, grief, or private shame. She looked at his face, at the exhaustion in it, at the sadness he could no longer cover with calm, and knew she would not leave carrying only half a truth. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "What are you?" The fire cracked softly. Lucien closed his eyes for one brief second, as though even hearing the question cost him something. When Lucien opened his eyes again, the silver had faded at the center, but not fully. Grey and light stood side by side in a way Tessa could not explain. He looked less dangerous than before, yet somehow more exposed. The effort of staying upright showed in every line of his face. For a few seconds he said nothing. Maeve bent to lift the broken lamp from the floor with careful hands, but her attention never left the two of them. The fire gave a low crack. Rain pressed harder against the windows. The room felt suspended, as if even the house was waiting for Lucian's answer. At last, he spoke. "Not sick," he said quietly. "Not mad. Not a trick." Tessa held his gaze. "That does not answer me." "No," he said, almost to himself. "It does not." He straightened a little, though the motion clearly cost him. One hand went back to the shelf, not for show now, but for support. The strange light beneath his skin had sunk into something faint, almost hidden, yet she could still see the last trace of it move once at his throat. Maeve set the broken lamp aside. "It is late. Tell her in the morning." Lucian's eyes stayed on Tessa. The calm he wore at dinner had not returned. What remained now was honesty stripped of comfort. "If you stay until morning," he said, "I will tell you what I can. What I can, not everything, not yet." Still, it was more than denial, more than the easy lie she expected. He was not asking her to forget what she had seen. He was asking for one night. Tessa knew she should leave. 10 minutes, he had said. A car. Full pay. One clean ending before this house moved any deeper under her skin. Yet, when she looked at him, she did not see cruelty. She saw pain, discipline, and the tired certainty of a man who had watched too many people choose fear over truth. So, she made the choice that shifted the course of everything. "I'll stay," she said. And before the sun rose over the cliffs, Tessa Munro would learn that Vale House was holding far more than one man's secret. Morning arrived quietly, as if the house itself had agreed not to force the night back into speech too quickly. Tessa woke before dawn had fully lifted, though she was not sure she had slept in any real sense. Her body had rested for a few hours, but her mind had stayed near the library, near the shattered lamp, near Lucian's silver eyes and the strange cold heat of his arm beneath her hand. When she opened her bedroom curtains, the sky beyond the cliffs was pale and washed in soft grey. The sea below calmer than it had been hours earlier. The storm had passed. The house had not. A tray waited outside her door. Tea, toast, fruit, a folded note. "Please come to the conservatory at 8. Alone. LV." Tessa read the note twice. The handwriting was neat, steady, and restrained, as though no part of the man who wrote it had shaken during the night. Yet she knew better now. She knew what calm looked like when it had been built under pressure. At exactly 8, she followed the eastern corridor down to the conservatory. The room stood behind tall glass doors at the far end of the house, filled with green plants, white stone, and light made soft by the morning mist still clinging to the windows. Ferns climbed out of large clay, planters. A narrow fountain sat silent in the center. Everything smelled faintly of wet leaves and cedar. Lucian was already there. He stood near the glass with both hands in his pockets, dressed in a charcoal sweater and dark trousers, composed again in the way he had been on her first arrival. If not for the memory of the night before, she might have questioned whether it had all happened the way she remembered. But one look at his face settled that. He appeared controlled, yes, but not untouched. A deep weariness sat beneath his features, and there was a gravity in his eyes that had not been there at dinner. He turned when he heard her enter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lucian pulled out the chair across from his and said, with a calm that felt earned rather than easy, "You stayed." Tessa did not sit immediately. She held his gaze and answered with the truth. "You said you would tell me what you could." He nodded once. Then, in the pale hush of the conservatory, Lucian Vale prepared to begin with the part of the truth that would change the shape of everything she thought she understood. Tessa sat across from him with both hands wrapped around the untouched cup Maeve had left at her place. Though the tea had little to do with comfort, the room was bright enough to feel honest, yet the memory of the night before still sat between them like a third presence. In daylight, Lucian looked human again in every outward way. Calm face, clear grey eyes, steady voice. If she had met him for the first time in that moment, she might have thought the whole thing belonged to exhaustion and fear, but she had seen too much to pretend. "What I saw last night was real," she said. Lucian did not flinch. "Yes. And you expect me to sit here as if that answer is enough?" "No." His gaze settled on the glass wall behind her for a second, before returning. I expect you to hear the rest and decide whether staying was a mistake." There was no pride in the line, no performance, only quiet acceptance. That caught her off guard more than any polished excuse would have. Most men with money protected themselves first. They softened facts, changed the order of events, spoke like control itself could erase discomfort. Lucien did none of that. He looked like a man who had spent a long time learning that truth could not save every bond, but lies would ruin whatever small chance remained. Tessa knew that feeling, in another form. After her mother died, people often spoke around pain instead of through it. They said strong things, neat things. Time helps. She is at peace. You will be fine. Yet the few people who helped most were the ones who sat in the wreckage without trying to tidy it too quickly. They let grief stay ugly while still treating her like she could survive it. Lucien seemed to be doing something close to that now. Not softening, not asking for pity, not pretending the truth would be easy to hear. And for the first time since the library, the strongest thing Tessa felt was not fear over what he was. It was the loneliness in the way he prepared to tell it. Lucien rested his forearms lightly on the table, not casual, not defensive, simply steadying himself for what came next. "I was born in this house," he said. "Not exactly in this room, but close enough that the walls would still remember if walls were able to speak." Tessa said nothing. He looked past her for a moment, toward the mist resting against the glass. "My family owned ships, timber, and more land than any one family had reason to keep. They were respected, feared in some places, admired in others. None of that mattered to me as much as my younger sister. She was the best thing in the house, loud where I was quiet, brave where I was careful." A faint shift crossed his face then, small but real. She loved the sea. I hated that she loved it, because it never loved anyone back. His voice stayed level, yet Tessa could hear the cost beneath it. One winter, there was a storm worse than the others. She slipped away from the house and went toward the caves below the cliff. I went after her. I reached her. I got her out. He paused, but I did not come back the same. Tessa's fingers tightened around the cup. "What does that mean?" Lucien met her eyes. "It means something happened in that water, something I still do not know how to name properly. I was alive when I entered it. I was alive when I returned. But whatever crossed back into this house wore my face and carried more than my life inside it." The conservatory felt colder, despite the morning light. He continued before she could speak. "At first my family called it survival, a miracle. Then the years passed, and I did not change. Wounds closed too quickly. Illness did not stay. Mirrors began, failing me at certain hours. Storms affected my body in ways I could not control. And every few years, for 30 days, holding myself together became harder." Tessa stared at him, not because the story sounded false, because he was telling it like a burden carried too long, not a tale polished for effect. That was what made it land, not the strangeness, the pain. Tessa sat very still after he finished speaking, though stillness did little to settle the force of what had just entered the room. The fountain in the middle of the conservatory gave a soft drip at uneven intervals. Somewhere beyond the glass, a gull cried over the cliffs. The world outside kept moving, as if Lucien had not calmly told her he had stepped into a storm more than a century ago and returned carrying something no one could fully name. She drew in a slow breath. "So all of this, the mirrors, the episodes, the storms, it comes back in cycles." "Yes." "And the 30 days?" Lucien's jaw tightened for a second before he answered. "The hardest stretch. The part where control demands the most." Tessa looked down at her tea, then back at him. "You said every caregiver before me lasted less than a day." "They did. Then why keep hiring strangers?" The question landed harder than the others. She could see it in the way his gaze lowered. Not in guilt exactly, but in the weight of an answer he did not like carrying. "Because I stopped believing anyone who knew me would stay once they understood enough," he said. Strangers were easier to lose. That struck her more sharply than the rest, not because it explained everything. It did not, but because the logic behind it was painfully human. A man feared being seen fully, so he chose people with no reason to remain. Safer for them, safer for him, less hope, less damage. Still, one question stayed lodged in her chest. "What did you expect from me?" She asked. "Routine, observation, company." "That is what Maeve said. But last night, when I touched you, something changed. So what exactly did you hire me for?" Lucian held her gaze this time. No softening, no escape. "To help me stay anchored to ordinary life while the cycle passes." The honesty in it made her pulse shift. Not because it was cruel, because it was precise. Tessa leaned back slowly. The room felt brighter, yet the truth inside it had turned heavier. If her presence was part of what kept him steady, then this was no longer a strange job wrapped in secrecy. It was something closer to a responsibility he had not fully warned her about. And the question rising now was far more dangerous than the first. If she stayed, what exactly would Lucian Vale become to her before the 30 days were over? The conservatory fell quiet after that. Tessa looked at Lucian for a long moment, trying to fit the man in front of her together with the things he had just confessed. A century-old storm, a body that healed too quickly, mirrors that failed him. 30 days of strain sharp enough to require a stranger's presence just to keep him tied to ordinary life. None of it should have felt believable. Yet sitting across from him in the grey morning light, with fatigue still shadowing his face and honesty sitting bare between them, disbelief felt weaker than silence. She should have stood up then. She should have thanked him for telling the truth, taken the money, and left before the house could pull her deeper into its rhythm. That would have been the safe decision, the sensible one, the kind choice to herself. Instead, she asked, "What happens if you fail to hold it together?" Lucian did not answer at once. That pause chilled her more than anything he had said before. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, but only just. "Each cycle takes something from me if I lose control for too long." Tessa's throat tightened. What kind of thing? He looked down at his hands. Memory, restraint, recognition. Small human pieces at first, then larger ones. The words landed slowly, and because of that, they hit harder. She stared at him. "You mean you can forget who you are?" "Yes." "And nobody thought that was important to put in the job description?" A faint, tired breath left him. Not quite a laugh. "No one writes listings for this kind of life, Tessa." She should not have noticed how gently he said her name. Yet she did. The wind brushed the glass overhead. Somewhere beyond the conservatory, footsteps passed and faded. Morning had fully arrived now, but instead of making things clearer, the daylight only sharpened the weight of the choice before her, because Lucian had not only told her what he was, he had just shown her what he feared becoming. And for the first time since entering Vale House, Tessa understood that staying might not only cost her comfort, it might ask for her heart before the month was done. The days that followed did not turn ordinary. They turned ordered. That difference mattered. Vale House still held its secrets close. The West Tower stayed locked. The lower level remained quiet in a way that invited no questions. Lucian still moved through the house with a reserve Tessa had not fully learned how to read. Yet after the truth in the conservatory, the place no longer felt like a trap closing around her. It felt like a world running on rules older than comfort, and slowly, almost against her own expectation, she began to find a rhythm inside it. Mornings arrived first, as pale fog over the cliffs. Tessa would wake to soft light pressing through the tall bedroom windows, and the distant sound of waves striking the rocks below. Maeve left breakfast at the same hour each day. Tea, fruit, fresh bread, sometimes eggs, always arranged with exact care. By the third morning, Tessa stopped feeling watched by the silence and started listening to it instead. She learned the house had layers, the groan of old wood when the air turned cold, the hush of staff footsteps that appeared and disappeared without waste, the faint clink of china from the back kitchen, the heavier quiet that settled when Lucian had withdrawn somewhere alone. Afternoons brought movement. When the weather held, Lucian walked the cliff path that curved along the estate boundary, and after the fourth day, he began asking Tessa to join him. The path overlooked dark water, jagged rock, and lines of pine bending toward the sea. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. Strangely, the silence outside felt easier than the silence indoors. It no longer pressed at her, it made room. Evenings belonged to smaller things. Books left open in the library. Tea taken near the fire. Short conversations that started with practical details and drifted into memory without warning. Once, late in the evening, she heard piano music somewhere deeper in the house, slow and careful, as though the person playing had not meant to be heard. What unsettled Tessa most was not the mystery anymore. It was how quickly the strange life inside Vale House was beginning to feel structured enough to trust, and that frightened her in a different way. What surprised Tessa most was not the house, it was herself. By the end of the first week, she had started measuring time in new ways, not by overdue notices, supplier calls, or Nolan's tuition reminders, not by the bookstore's slow sales, or the ache that lived behind her eyes after too many double shifts. At Vale House, time moved, through smaller things. The hour Maeve brought tea. The moment fog lifted enough to expose the sea. The sound of Lucian's footsteps in the corridor before breakfast. The quiet stretch after sunset, when the whole house seemed to exhale. That change should have felt like relief. Instead, it made her uneasy at first. Back in Portland, her life had been built around being needed. The bookstore needed saving. Nolan needed steadiness. Bills needed paying. Customers needed patience. Her mother, before the end, had needed strength Tessa did not always know she possessed until it was demanded from her. Need had become the shape of her days. Noise had become proof she was still holding things together. Here, the quiet asked something different. It asked her to notice herself. That was harder. On the 7th morning, Lucian found her in the small breakfast room, staring out at the sea with her untouched tea growing cold. He paused near the doorway, his expression unreadable in the gentle light. "You look homesick," he said. Tessa gave a small smile without turning fully toward him. "I'm not sure that's the word." "What is?" She thought about it before answering. "Uncertain, maybe. Peace feels strange when you are used to bracing for the next problem." He understood that too quickly for the line to feel polite. "That kind of habit is difficult to lose," he said. She looked at him then. "You sound like someone who has tried." A faint shadow crossed his face, there and gone. "I sound like someone who knows calm and safety are not always the same thing." That answer stayed with her all day. Because beneath the mystery, beneath the house, beneath everything impossible about Lucian Vale, Tessa was beginning to relate to the one thing she had not expected. The exhaustion of always carrying more than anyone else could see. The more time Tessa spent at Vale House, the more she saw that Lucian's life was built on restraint. It showed in small ways first. He never raised his voice across a room. He never called for staff unless it was needed. He thanked Maeve for every meal, even when he barely touched it. He kept conversations brief when his energy was low, not out of coldness, but out of caution. As if he had learned the cost of saying too much when control felt thin. There was discipline in everything he did, from the way he folded letters after reading them to the exact place he set his glass down at dinner. Yet the deeper surprise was what Tessa discovered beyond the house. On the 9th day, Maeve sent her into town for a list of supplies the kitchen needed. The village sat small and weathered near the harbour, all stone paths, old storefronts and salt-worn windows. At the grocer's, an older woman behind the counter asked where Tessa was staying. When Tessa answered, the woman's brows rose. "At the Vale estate." Tessa nodded carefully. The woman wrapped bread in paper and said, "Well, tell him the school roof held through the storm. We're still grateful." Tessa paused. "The school roof?" The woman looked surprised. "You didn't know?" He paid for most of it. Asked for no fuss over it either. That was not the only thing. At the pharmacy, a man near the register mentioned winter coats donated to children 3 years running. At the dock, a fisherman spoke about an engine repair fund that had helped keep 2 boats working through a bad season. No one spoke Lucian's name loudly. Some avoided it altogether, yet his help was there in pieces, spread across the town like quiet stitches holding worn fabric together. When she returned that afternoon, Tessa found him in the library reviewing papers near the window. "You let people thank other men for what you do," she said. Lucian looked up. "It is often easier for them." "That sounds lonely." "It is efficient." She studied him for a moment. "Those are not the same thing." For the first time, a real smile touched his face, brief and restrained, but real enough to alter the room. "No," he said softly. "They are not." That evening, rain pressed softly against the library windows, while Lucien stood near the shelves, sorting through a stack of letters sealed with cream-colored paper and dark wax. Tessa sat in the armchair by the fire with one of the novels she had brought from Portland, though she had not turned a page in several minutes. Her mind stayed on the village, on the school roof, the winter coats, the repaired boats, and the quiet way his name moved through town without ever asking to be praised. At last, she closed the book on one finger and looked at him. "Why do you hide all of it?" Lucien did not answer right away. He set one letter aside, then another, keeping his focus on the table, as if the arrangement of paper mattered more than the question. "I do not hide it," he said. "I simply prefer not to stand in the middle of it." Tessa leaned back slowly. "That is not true." Now he looked at her. "You do hide it," she said. "You pay for things people need. You step in when no one else knows how. You let other people carry the thanks. That is not modesty, that is distance." The fire gave a low crack between them. Lucien's gaze held hers, steady but guarded. Distance keeps life simpler. For who? His expression shifted, only slightly. For everyone involved. Tessa let that sit for a second. Then she asked the question that had been building since morning. "Do you really believe that? Or have you simply told yourself that for so long it became easier than wanting anything else?" The room went still. Lucien lowered his eyes first, which told her more than a quick answer could have. He rested one hand against the table and gave a tired breath that held no irritation, only the weight of old habits being touched too closely. "When people know too much," he said at last, "their lives tend to become more complicated." Tessa watched him carefully. "That sounds like fear, not wisdom." His mouth tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. And sitting there in the firelight, Tessa began to understand that the real question around Lucien Vale was no longer what he was. It was why a man who cared so deeply had decided he did not deserve to be known fully. 2 nights later, the power went out just after 9. One moment, the house held its usual soft light, warm lamps in the corridor, a glow under the library door, the quiet shine from sconces along the staircase. The next, everything fell dark. Not dim, dark enough to make the whole estate feel older at once. Tessa stopped in the corridor with one hand on the wall. A second later, she heard Maeve's voice somewhere below, calm and controlled. "Stay where you are. I'll bring candles." The house obeyed her voice better than it obeyed the weather. Wind pressed hard against the windows. Rain moved across the glass in sharp bursts. Tessa made her way down the hall by memory, and the faint silver wash of moonlight leaking through the tall panes. By the time she reached the kitchen, Maeve had already set 3 candles on the long wooden table. Their flames threw a gentle gold over the room, softening the stone walls, the copper pans, the dark shelves, the quiet weight of the storm outside. Lucien stood near the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel. Without electric light, he looked less like the distant owner of the estate and more like a man cut loose from time. His hair had fallen slightly across his forehead. Firelight touched one side of his face. The reserve he usually wore seemed thinner in that room, under that weather, under that simpler light. Maeve left them with tea and a tray of biscuits, muttering something about checking the east wing. The door closed behind her. For a while, neither Tessa nor Lucien spoke. Then Lucien looked at her and asked, "Before life became survival, what did you want?" The question landed with quiet force. Tessa wrapped both hands around her cup and stared into the steam. No one had asked her that in a long time. Not what she needed, not what was urgent, what she wanted. At one point, she said slowly, "I wanted to build a reading room above the bookstore. Soft chairs, late hours, poetry nights. A place for people who had nowhere else to go." Lucien's eyes stayed on her. "A place for tired hearts," he said. Tessa looked up. He said it so softly, so precisely, that it felt less like a guess and more like he had seen the shape of her longing before she had fully spoken it. And in that candle-lit kitchen, with the storm holding the world outside and the silence between them turning warmer than it had any right to be, Tessa felt the first dangerous shift. This house was no longer only becoming familiar. It was beginning to feel like somewhere she might not want to leave. After the storm night in the kitchen, something small but undeniable changed between them. Tessa noticed it the next morning before a single word was spoken. She entered the breakfast room expecting the usual quiet. Tea set neatly at one end of the table, pale light over the sea, the house still half asleep around her. Lucien was already there. That was not unusual. What felt new was the way he looked up the moment she entered, as if he had been listening for her steps. "Good morning," he said. The words were simple, yet there was a warmth in them that had not been there before. Not careless warmth, not open affection, but something gentler than politeness. Tessa felt it at once and hated how quickly her pulse answered. She sat across from him and reached for the teapot. "You sound almost cheerful." "One should not overstate the matter," he said. That dry reply drew a laugh out of her before she could stop it. Lucien's mouth shifted slightly at one corner, not a full smile. Still, it stayed a second longer than usual, and the room felt different because of it. The change showed itself all day in brief, dangerous ways. A pause too long when he handed her a book in the library and his fingers brushed hers. A look held just a second past comfort when she turned during their walk on the cliff path and found him already watching her. A softness in his voice when he asked whether she had slept well, a quiet attentiveness that made her feel less like an employee in his house and more like someone whose presence altered the shape of his day. None of it was enough to name aloud. That made it worse. Because Tessa had lived long enough to know attraction rarely arrived in one dramatic moment. It entered through details, tone, timing, a shared silence that no longer felt empty, a question asked too carefully, a glance that lingered when it should have passed. By evening, she had stopped asking herself whether something was building between them. The harder question now was how long they both intended to pretend they did not feel it. Tessa spent the rest of that day trying to behave as though nothing inside her had shifted. She helped Maeve sort fresh linens in the upstairs storage room. She answered Nolan's message with steady words and no mention of Lucien. She walked through the back garden just before dusk and told herself the cold air would clear her head. None of it worked. No matter what she touched, folded or answered, her thoughts kept returning to the breakfast room, to Lucien's voice, to the quiet way his eyes found her first. That was what made the whole thing dangerous. It was not sudden, it was not loud, it was not the kind of feeling she could dismiss as foolish excitement in a strange place. It had grown through small moments she had let herself excuse, because each one, on its own, seemed harmless. A shared silence by the sea, a question asked with real care, a rare smile that reached him before he pulled it back. His hand at the small of her back on the cliff path, when loose gravel gave way beneath her shoe. The way he listened when she spoke, as if her words deserved more than polite attention. She knew better than to trust something like that too quickly. Lucien was still a mystery in ways no tenderness could erase. He carried more history than he had told her. He lived inside rules she was only beginning to understand. Even his honesty came in pieces. Wanting a man like that felt reckless enough. Wanting him while living under his roof felt worse. Yet the deeper truth was harder to ignore. Tessa had not been looked after in a very long time. Needed, yes. Relied on, certainly. Admired for her strength, sometimes. But gently noticed in the middle of ordinary moments. Asked what she wanted. Seen when she was quiet. That had become rare enough in her life to feel almost unfamiliar. So when attraction rose, it did not feel shallow. It felt tied to something she had gone without for too long. And standing at the bedroom window that night, watching fog drift over the cliffs, Tessa admitted what she had been trying not to say even to herself. She was not only curious about Lucien Vale anymore, she was beginning to care what he thought of her. The days after that carried a softness Tessa had not expected, and because it came in such quiet forms, it worked its way past her guard before she knew what to do with it. Lucien began joining her for breakfast each morning, not with grand effort, not as if announcing a new habit, but with a steady presence that soon felt natural. Some days he arrived first and poured her tea before she entered. Other days he came in a few minutes later, still buttoning the cuff of his dark shirt, looking less like the untouchable owner of Vale House and more like a man who had chosen not to begin his day alone. He also started speaking with a lighter tone when the mood allowed it. When Tessa frowned over a book in the library one rainy afternoon, Lucien paused by her chair and asked, "Are you reading that, or trying to win a private argument with it?" She looked up. "The author is being difficult. A tragic habit in writers. You sound offended on their behalf. I am defending a profession that has kept many lonely people alive." The line caught her off guard. So did the look in his eyes after he said it. It was dry, almost playful. Yet something deeper sat beneath it. Tessa smiled despite herself. "That is the most dramatic defense of bad writing I've ever heard." "I had a good education," he said with perfect calm. That made her laugh, and Lucien's face changed with the sound of it. Not fully, not carelessly. Still, she saw the shift. He liked drawing that laugh from her. He liked watching her forget to be guarded for a moment. The house changed too when he softened. Rooms that once felt formal grew easier to sit in. Silence no longer pressed at her chest. The library felt warmer when he looked up from his papers just to ask what page she was on. The breakfast room felt smaller, in a good way, when he stayed after tea instead of disappearing at once. Even the long corridor outside the conservatory seemed less cold when his voice carried through it. Tessa noticed all of it. So did Maeve, who said nothing, yet watched them sometimes with the quiet expression of someone seeing a pattern form and choosing not to interrupt it. That was the trouble now. This was no longer only about mystery, duty, or staying careful inside a strange house. Piece by piece, Lucien was becoming easier to be near, and that kind of comfort had its own danger. The question arrived on a quiet evening in the music room. Tessa had followed the sound of piano through the west corridor just after dusk, not loud, not polished for an audience, but careful and private, as though the person playing had forgotten for a few minutes that anyone else lived in the house. She paused at the doorway and saw Lucien seated at the piano with his head slightly bowed, one hand resting briefly above the keys before the next phrase began. He stopped the moment he noticed her. "Do not stop," she said. Lucien glanced back at the keyboard. "I have not played for anyone in years." "Then tonight counts." For a second, he seemed to weigh the idea. Then he turned back and let his hands return to the keys. The melody that followed was slow and restrained, carrying more feeling than display. Tessa crossed the room quietly and sat near the window, saying nothing, letting the music fill the space between them. When he finished, the silence afterward felt fuller than speech. "You look less lonely when you play," she said. Lucien turned on the bench to face her. Candlelight from the mantel touched one side of his face, leaving the rest in softer shadow. His expression held none of the usual distance. "I look less lonely when you are in the room." The line landed with gentle force. Tessa did not answer at once. She could not. Her pulse had turned suddenly unsteady, and she hated how clearly he must have seen that. Still, she held his gaze, because now the question between them had changed again. Not what he was, not what he feared, not even whether something had grown between them. The question was what happened next when two people spent day after day stepping closer to a feeling neither of them had planned for. Tessa drew a slow breath. "Do you always say dangerous things that calmly?" A faint smile touched his mouth. "Only when they are true." And in that small room with the piano between them, she understood that the distance they had both relied on was beginning to fail. After the music room, neither of them knew how to return to easier ground. Tessa felt it first at dinner. Maeve served the meal with her usual quiet precision, but the room no longer held the same safe distance it once had. Lucien sat across from her, calm as ever to anyone else's eye, yet every glance between them carried the memory of what he had said. "I look less lonely when you are in the room." It had not sounded flirtatious. It had sounded worse, honest. That honesty followed her through the evening. She tried reading in the library, but the words blurred. She tried writing Nolan a message, but deleted 2 drafts before sending a simple line about the weather and the view. She even walked the upstairs corridor twice, telling herself movement might quiet the restless feeling in her chest. It did not. Near 10, she stepped onto the east balcony for air. The night was cold enough to sharpen thought. Below, the sea moved in dark silver under a thin moon, and the pines bent gently in the wind. Tessa gripped the stone rail and let the cold settle into her skin. She had come to this house for money, for time, for survival. Nothing about the plan had included standing awake at night, because one man's voice had started living too close beneath her thoughts. The balcony door opened softly behind her. She did not need to turn to know it was Lucien. He stopped a short distance away, giving her space even now. "You should be wearing a coat. You should stop appearing out of nowhere." A quiet breath left him, almost a laugh. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence did not feel empty. It felt charged with all the things neither of them had said after the piano. At last, Lucien stepped closer, not enough to touch, only enough for her to feel his presence beside her in the cold. "Tessa," he said, low and careful, "there are parts of this house that become harder to survive once they begin to feel like home." She turned to him then. The words landed deeper than they should have. Because, in that moment, with the sea below and the night wrapped around them, Tessa understood the danger clearly. She was no longer only afraid of what Lucien might be. She was afraid she was starting to need him too. Silas Cade arrived on the 14th day just after noon. At the exact hour, Vale House usually settled into its calmest stretch. The morning fog had finally lifted, leaving the cliffs sharp against a pale sky and the sea bright enough to hurt the eyes. Tessa had spent the earlier part of the day in the back garden with Maeve, trimming dead stems from a row of climbing roses that had not yet decided whether spring could be trusted. The quiet had felt almost gentle. Even Lucien, who had spent most of breakfast working through a stack of letters, seemed steadier than usual. Nothing in the air warned her that the peace of the house was about to change. She heard the car first. Not the long black vehicle that had brought her there, but something sleeker, faster, louder in the gravel. It cut through the stillness with the confidence of someone who expected gates to open and doors to follow. Maeve straightened at once. Garden shears paused in her hand. Her face did not harden exactly, but whatever softness the morning had earned disappeared. "Who is that?" Tessa asked. Maeve looked toward the drive with open dislike. A man who mistakes persistence for charm. That alone was enough to sharpen Tessa's attention. From the side path, she could see the front court clearly. A dark blue car had stopped at the base of the steps. A man stepped out in a fitted coat and polished shoes that had no business near sea gravel. He moved easily, with the relaxed assurance of someone accustomed to entering rooms already convinced he would own them by the time he left. Tall, neatly dressed, clean-cut in the expensive way that invited trust too quickly, he carried a leather portfolio under one arm and a smile that seemed practiced for other people's defenses. Lucien came through the front doors before the visitor had reached the top step. The shift in him was immediate. Not fear, not surprise, something colder. The kind of reserve Tessa had first noticed on the day she arrived, only sharper now, as though one look at the man below had drawn an invisible line through the afternoon. The visitor stopped and lifted his gaze. "Lucien," he called, warm, as if greeting an old friend. "I was beginning to think you'd keep hiding behind those gates forever." Lucien did not move from the doorway, and standing in the garden with dirt on her gloves and a new tension curling through the house, Tessa understood at once that this was not a casual visit. This was an intrusion wearing a smile. Tessa had met men like Silas Cade before, not in houses like this, not with cliffs and iron gates behind them, but in enough forms to know the pattern. They were the sort of men who entered a space already speaking, as if trust had been earned. Men who smiled before listening. Men who made confidence look like kindness, until a person noticed how little warmth lived underneath it. In the bookstore, they had come as landlords, sales reps, and polished donors who loved being seen near struggling places more than they loved helping them. In care work, they appeared as wealthy sons who praised patients in public and treated staff like furniture in private. Tessa had learned to watch tone more than words. Tone told the truth faster. Silas had that tone. Even from a distance she could feel it. The easy wave, the bright voice, the polished coat without a spot of rain on it. Everything about him announced ease, but none of it felt restful. He carried himself like a man who liked the sound of his own certainty and expected the world to arrange itself around it. Maeve set the shears down on the stone bench with more force than before. He never comes here unless he wants something. Tessa glanced at her. What does he want? Maeve's mouth thinned. What men like him always want. More. That answer sat heavily with her, because by now Tessa knew enough about Vale House to sense when its quiet had been disturbed by more than inconvenience. Lucian rarely reacted in visible ways. Even during difficult moments, he held himself with controlled restraint. Yet from the garden path, she could see the difference in him now. His shoulders were set. His face had gone still in the hard way. The distance he usually wore like armor had sharpened into something closer to warning. Silas reached the steps and stopped just below the landing, smiling as if this were a social call. Tessa did not trust that smile for a second. There was a type of danger that arrived loud and obvious. She knew how to brace for that. Silas felt different. Clean shoes, smooth voice, pleasant face. The sort of man who would place a knife on the table and call it an offer. And for reasons she could not yet explain, that unsettled her more than open hostility ever could. Lucian did not invite Silas inside at once. That alone told Tessa more than a long explanation could have. For several quiet seconds, the two men faced each other across the front steps, while the sea wind moved through the trees and lifted the edge of Silas's coat. Up close, the difference between them felt even sharper. Lucian stood in dark clothes, composed and unreadable, as if every part of him had gone still on purpose. Silas looked brighter, easier, almost charming at a glance, yet the ease around him felt polished rather than natural. "At least hear me out," Silas said, still smiling. "I drove all this way to save you from making another sentimental mistake." Lucian's voice stayed calm. "You came to sell me the same bad idea, with better paper." Silas lifted the leather portfolio slightly. Better numbers, not better paper. Maeve moved to stand near the front hall, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough to make clear that she was listening. Tessa stayed back by the garden path, though Silas noticed her almost at once. His eyes flicked toward her with quick interest before returning to Lucian. "You have company," he said. "That's new." Lucian did not answer. Silas continued, as if silence were permission. "I assume no one has explained the development plan properly. The coastline south of the estate is wasted as it stands. The resort would bring jobs, tourism, new money into town. You'd be turning dead land into something useful." "Dead land," Lucian repeated, and this time, the chill in his voice became impossible to miss. "You mean protected shoreline, fishing access, family property with burial rights older than your business license." Silas spread one hand in a gesture meant to look reasonable. "I mean, opportunity." That word seemed to harden the air. Tessa understood then that this was not merely a business disagreement. Silas was not asking for land. He was asking Lucian to surrender history, memory, and something rooted far deeper than profit sheets could measure. And when Silas glanced at her a second time, smiling as if she might be easier to persuade than the man at the door, Tessa felt the first real warning rise in her chest. This man had not only come for the estate, he had already begun looking for another way in. Silas did not stay long on the steps. After a few more clipped lines about permits, shoreline access and projected value, Lucian finally allowed him into the front hall. Though allowed felt too generous for the mood that followed. It was less an invitation than a refusal to perform the disagreement outdoors. Tessa remained in the corridor near the library entrance, while Maeve disappeared toward the kitchen, likely to ensure the house still looked orderly even with trouble standing in the middle of it. Silas carried his portfolio into the drawing room like he already knew where every chair belonged. He set the leather case on the low table, opened it, and laid out glossy plans with smooth, careful hands. Renderings of glass buildings, terraces facing the sea, private docks, name printed in sharp silver letters across the top of the proposal. It all looked expensive, neat, and entirely wrong for the coastline Tessa had come to know. Lucian did not sit. "You keep returning, as if repetition will make me careless," he said. Silas gave a mild smile. "I keep returning because one day practicality will outrank nostalgia. That line landed badly. Tessa saw it in Lucian's face before he even answered. The slight tightening around his mouth. The hard calm settling more deeply across his features. Whatever this estate meant to him, it was not a sentimental hobby. It was a piece of something older, heavier, and far more personal than Silas either understood or respected. Then Silas looked toward Tessa. "You've been here, what, 2 weeks?" he asked, as though they had already been introduced in some friendly social setting. "Long enough to know this place is too large for one man and his memories." Lucian's gaze turned cold. "Leave her out of it." Silas lifted one hand. "I'm including her because she has eyes. Surely she can see what this costs you." Tessa said nothing at first. That silence seemed to encourage him. He leaned back slightly, polished and comfortable, and asked the question he had been circling from the moment he arrived. "Tell me honestly, Miss Monroe, does this house feel like a place built for living or for hiding?" The room went quiet after that, and Tessa understood that the real pressure had finally begun. Silas was not only asking about buildings or land, he was asking her which version of Lucian she believed in. Silas left an hour later, but the house did not settle after he was gone. That was the strange part. Usually, Vale House returned to its own order quickly. Doors closed, footsteps softened, the sea reclaimed the silence between rooms. But after Silas walked back down the front steps with his polished shoes and easy smile, something of him remained behind. Not his voice, not his plans spread across the drawing-room table, but the pressure he had dragged in with him. It stayed in the air like a question no one wanted to answer first. Tessa stood in the front hall and watched from the window as the dark blue car disappeared through the gates. Only then did Lucian speak. "What did he say to you when I stepped outside to take that call?" The question came too quickly to be casual. Tessa turned. Lucian stood near the doorway of the drawing room, one hand resting against the frame, his face composed again but not relaxed. He had regained control of his expression, yet the calm did not reach his eyes. Maeve, carrying the abandoned portfolio papers in neat stacks, paused for one brief second before moving on, as if she already knew the answer mattered. Tessa hesitated. That told Lucian enough. He crossed the distance between them slowly, not in anger, but with a quiet focus that made her pulse shift. "Tessa, he showed me photographs," she said. Lucian's face changed, only slightly, but enough. "Old newspaper clippings too," she continued. "You in 1928, you in 1951, you in 1986. She swallowed once. The same face, the same eyes. Silence met her. Then Lucian looked away toward the darkening windows, and for the first time since Silas arrived, he seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with the cycle. "He wanted you to be afraid," he said. Tessa held his gaze. "He wanted me to think you did not tell me everything." Lucian did not deny it. That hurt more than she expected, because in the space left by his silence, a harder truth rose between them. Silas had not broken the peace simply by arriving. He had done something worse. He had placed doubt exactly where trust had only just begun to grow. The confrontation began before sunset, in the conservatory where Lucian had first told her enough truth to keep her from leaving. By late afternoon, the sky had turned heavy again, grey clouds pressing low over the cliffs while rain gathered at the edges of the glass roof above. The room should have felt calm. White stone floor, ferns breathing green into the quiet. The same table where he once sat with his hands folded and his voice steady while he spoke of storms, mirrors, and a life that refused to move like other lives. Yet none of that softness remained now. The place felt sharper, almost exposed, as if every pane of glass had turned into a witness. Tessa stood near the window, with Silas's words still moving through her mind like grit she could not swallow. "You do not know all of him. Whatever he told you, it was edited." She hated that the line had found a place inside her. She hated even more that Lucian's silence in the front hall had fed it. When he entered the conservatory, he closed the door quietly behind him. That small care only made her anger rise faster. He looked composed again. Dark sweater, controlled face, grey eyes that gave little away at first glance. Yet she knew him better now. Better than when she arrived. Better than when she first mistook restraint for coldness. The tension in his shoulders told her enough. He had come ready for this. "Tessa," he said. She turned fully toward him. "Did you know he had those photographs?" Lucien did not answer at once. That pause felt like a blade. Rain began at last, tapping lightly overhead. "Did you?" she asked again. "Yes." One word. Calm, clean, damaging. Tessa gave a short laugh that held no humor. "So he did not lie." "No," Lucien said. "He used the truth with bad intentions. That does not change the part where it was still truth." He held her gaze, and in that silent second, the distance between them felt wider than the room, because this time, the danger was no longer his strange nature, his changing eyes, or the mystery inside the house. This time, the danger was simple. Trust had cracked. Tessa had imagined many things might wound her at Vale House. Fear, yes. Confusion, certainly. Even grief, once she began to understand how much of Lucien's life had been shaped by silence and endurance. But she had not expected this sharp, personal kind of hurt, the kind that came not from what he was, but from what he had chosen not to say. That was why it landed so hard. If Lucien had lied about the storm, the mirrors, or the strange changes in his body, she might have left without argument. A clean betrayal would have been easier to face, easier to name, easier to protect herself from. But this was harder, because he had told her real things, painful things. Enough truth to draw her close. Enough honesty to make her lower her guard. Now she stood in the same room where he had trusted her with impossible facts, only to realize he had still kept one more truth behind his back. Not a small one, either. A truth that involved her. She looked at him across the conservatory and thought of the night in the library, of his body giving way beneath strain, of the shock in his eyes when she touched him. She thought of the mornings that followed, the cliff walks, the firelit conversations, the music room, the words on the balcony, all those quiet moments that had begun to feel real because she believed she was being allowed closer to the center of him. Now a different thought moved in their place. What if closeness had not been freely chosen on his side at all? What if part of her role in this house had always been functional before it became emotional? That was the wound, not that he needed help. She could understand need, not that he was afraid. She could understand fear. It was that he had let her step closer, while still deciding for her how much she should know. Tessa had spent too much of her life carrying burdens others placed on her without warning. She knew what it felt like to be made responsible first, and informed second. Standing there in the rain-lit conservatory, that old ache returned with fresh force. And because she cared for Lucien now, the hurt did not stay clean. It deepened. Lucien took one slow breath, as if he were choosing each word before it reached the air. "There is more," he said. Tessa folded her arms, not for comfort, but to hold herself still. "There always is." A flicker of pain crossed his face. "Yes." Rain moved harder across the glass above them. The conservatory filled with that soft, relentless sound, steady enough to make the silence between his sentences feel even heavier. "When you touched me in the library," Lucien said, "it did more than calm the episode. It anchored me." Tessa stared at him. The word landed at once, not because she did not understand it, but because she did. "You knew that could happen?" "No." His answer came quickly, not with certainty. "I knew presence helped, routine helped, human closeness helped. But what happened that night, the speed of it, the strength of it, that was new." Her jaw tightened. "So after that, you kept me here knowing I was part of what held you together." Lucien did not hide from it. "Yes." The single word hit with brutal clarity. Tessa laughed once under her breath, hurt turning sharp. That would have been useful information. "I know, you know?" Her voice rose before she could stop it. "You let me sit across from you at breakfast. You walked with me on those cliffs. You let me think I was choosing this freely while part of you already knew I mattered to your control. I did not force you to stay. No, you did something worse. You let me care before telling me the full cost." That struck him. She saw it. His shoulders tightened, and for the first time since entering the conservatory, some of his careful calm slipped. "I hired you because I needed help," he said. "Lower now. That part is true. But I kept you near because I wanted you near. Both things became true at once, and by the time I understood what that meant, I had already failed you. Be honest in the comments. Do you think Lucien crossed a line by not telling Tessa everything earlier, or do you think fear made him handle it badly? Tessa's throat ached, because that was the cruelty of it. The answer did not feel clean. It felt human, tangled, painful, and too honest to dismiss. And standing there in the rain-lit room, she realized the line between being needed and being wanted had just become the most dangerous line in the house. For a long moment, Tessa said nothing. She turned away from Lucien and looked out through the rain-streaked glass. One hand pressed against the back of the chair beside her. The cliffs beyond the conservatory had nearly disappeared behind weather and mist, leaving only pale water and the dark outline of trees bending in the wind. It gave her something to focus on besides the ache in her chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. What happens if I leave now? Behind her, Lucien did not answer at once. That silence said enough to make her close her eyes for a second. Tessa, he said, careful now, as if each word had to cross broken ground. I will manage. She turned back toward him sharply. That is not what I asked. His gaze held hers. Steady, tired, honest in the hardest way. The truth sat between them before he even said it. If you leave during the cycle, he said, holding control becomes harder. Harder, she repeated, or dangerous. His jaw tightened. Lucien. Yes, he said at last. Dangerous. The word landed heavily in the room. Not because it shocked her, because part of her had already known. Tessa folded her arms again, but this time the motion felt less defensive than necessary, as if her own body needed something to hold on to. So, from the moment I touched you in that library, I stopped being only a caregiver. Yes, and you still let me keep walking deeper into this house without telling me that. He lowered his eyes briefly, then looked back at her. I told myself I needed time to understand it first. That is not the same as giving me a choice. No, he said, it is not. Rain beat harder against the glass roof. Tessa took a slow breath, then another. The question inside her had finally sharpened into its real shape, and asking it felt like stepping onto ice and knowing it might crack. If I stay now, she said, each word measured, how do I know whether I am staying because I choose you, or because you have become dependent on me in a way I never agreed to? That question did what anger had not. It stripped the room bare, because for the first time since she arrived at Vale House, neither mystery nor affection could protect them from the truth they now had to face. Tessa left the conservatory before the argument could turn into something weaker than truth. She did not run. She refused to give the moment that kind of chaos. Instead, she walked out with her head high, crossed the corridor, climbed the staircase, and shut the bedroom door behind her with more control than she felt. Only then did she let herself breathe the way pain demanded. The room that had slowly begun to feel familiar now felt uncertain again. Her suitcase still stood near the wardrobe. The books she had placed on the nightstand. The folded sweater on the chair. Small signs of a stay that, until an hour ago, had begun to feel almost chosen. Tessa stared at them and felt anger rise again, this time quieter, heavier, more difficult to shake. Lucien had not lied in the simplest sense. That was the trouble. He had told her enough truth to earn her compassion, enough truth to earn her trust, enough truth to let her step toward him with open eyes, while still keeping back the one fact that turned her presence into something more than comfort. Need. That word sat in her chest like a stone. A knock came at the door just after dusk. Not Lucien. Maeve. Tessa opened it halfway. Maeve stood in the corridor holding a tray with tea she would not drink, and a plate of untouched food she did not want. Her expression held no pity, only the grave steadiness of someone who had lived too long beside difficult truths to fear them. You should eat, Maeve said. I'm not hungry. Maeve nodded once, as though she expected nothing else. Then she placed the tray on the small table inside the door and turned back toward Tessa. He did not tell you because he was afraid, she said quietly. Not of what he is, of what your knowing it would cost him. Tessa's throat tightened. That does not make it right. No, Maeve said. It does not. She stepped back into the corridor. But tonight will test him harder than the last one did. Tessa looked up sharply. Why? Maeve held her gaze for one long second. Because now he has something to lose. Then she walked away. Tessa closed the door slowly, but Maeve's words did not leave with her. They stayed in the room, in the silence, in the space between anger and concern. And as night gathered again over Vale House, Tessa understood the cruel shape of the choice in front of her. If she went to Lucian, her heart would move deeper into danger. If she did not, something far worse might break before morning. Tessa did not realize she had fallen asleep until a sound unlike any she had heard before pulled her awake. It was not loud. That was what made it worse. No crash, no shouted voice, no slammed door. Just a deep, wrong kind of silence pressing against the room so heavily that her body reacted before her mind understood why. She sat up in bed with her heart already racing. The dark bedroom washed in faint silver from the storm outside. Rain moved across the window in hard, slanting lines. The curtains stirred slightly where the frame did not seal well. Somewhere below, the sea struck the rocks with a force that seemed to travel up through the cliff and into the bones of the house. Tessa held still and listened. Nothing. Then, the silence shifted. Not broken, exactly. Disturbed. Like the air itself had tightened around something happening just beyond sight. She threw off the blankets and crossed to the window barefoot, hardly feeling the cold floor beneath her feet. When she reached the glass and pulled the curtain back, the view stopped her cold. Lucian was outside. He stood at the far edge of the cliff lawn in the middle of the storm, one knee close to the ground, one hand pressed into the wet earth as if the land itself were the only thing keeping him from falling. Wind tore at his coat. Rain struck him without mercy. Around him, the darkness looked wrong. Not empty, but alive with brief pale flashes that rose and vanished too quickly to be ordinary light. Then she saw his throat. That same cold brightness moved beneath his skin, stronger now, climbing toward his jaw in thin, fierce lines. Even from the window, she could tell he was barely holding himself together. Tessa's breath caught. He looked less like a man standing in a storm, and more like someone being pulled apart by it. Behind her, the bedroom door shook once in its frame as the wind hit the side of the house. But Tessa did not move away from the window. She could not, because in that one terrible instant, anger gave way to something far more urgent. Lucian was not hiding from her tonight. He was breaking where she could see him. For one breath, Tessa stayed frozen at the window, her hand still gripping the curtain, her pulse hammering so hard it seemed to shake the room with her. Only hours earlier, she had stood in the conservatory demanding truth from Lucian with all the hurt she had every right to feel. She had left him there with anger sharp in her chest, with questions he could not soften, with the bitter knowledge that caring for him had already cost her more than safety. She had told herself distance was the only wise answer now. Space, thought, time enough to separate compassion from confusion. Yet, none of that held steady while she watched him through the rain, because whatever hurt sat between them, it did not erase what she knew. Lucian had not hidden behind cruelty. He had hidden behind fear, poor judgment, and the desperate hope that if he delayed one truth a little longer, he might keep from losing the only closeness he had begun to trust. That did not excuse him. It did not make the wound clean. But standing at the window now, Tessa could no longer pretend she was looking at a man who had tried to control her for pleasure or power. She was looking at someone in pain. She knew pain too well to mistake it. Her mother, trying to smile through weakness. Nolan, pretending lightness when money worried him. Herself, learning how to stand steady in rooms where no one asked how tired she was. Pain wore many faces, but it always had one thing in common. It made pride look useless when the body finally gave way. Lucian had reached that point now. The anger in her chest did not disappear. It changed shape. It made room for fear, for grief, for the awful pull of caring for someone when caring had suddenly become dangerous to the heart. Tessa pressed her palm to the cold window glass and watched him struggle against the storm, and one truth rose above every other thought. If she stayed in this room tonight, she would not be protecting herself. She would be abandoning him while he fell apart in front of her. Tessa moved before fear could build a stronger case. She dragged on the first coat she could reach, shoved her feet into boots without socks, and pulled the bedroom door open so fast it struck the wall. The corridor outside was dark except for the weak glow of 2 lamps fighting the storm. Halfway to the stairs, Maeve appeared from the far end of the hall, already awake, already dressed, as if she had been listening for this exact moment. "Do not go out there," Maeve said. Tessa did not stop. "He's alone. He chose that." "No," Tessa said, breathless now as she reached the top of the staircase. "He chose not to let anyone see this." Maeve followed her down 2 steps. "Tessa, listen to me. When the cycle turns this hard, he does not always know where the line is. If you go near him now, you may reach the part of him that is no longer thinking clearly." Tessa turned then, one hand gripping the banister. "And if I stay in here while he tears himself apart out there?" Maeve's face tightened, just enough to show the strain beneath her control. "That is not what I want." "Then stop trying to make me watch from a window." She kept moving. The front door was harder to open than she expected. Wind shoved against it from the outside, forcing her to lean her weight into the handle before it finally gave. Rain struck her at once, cold and sharp, soaking her hair, her sleeves, her face. The lawn beyond the terrace gleamed black under the storm. At the cliff edge, Lucian had shifted lower now, one knee in the mud, one hand still braced against the earth, shoulders bowed as though the sky itself had settled on his back. A pale line flashed beneath the skin of his throat. Then another. Tessa ran. Wet grass slid under her boots. Wind pushed hard against her coat. Rain blurred the distance. Yet she kept her eyes on him, on the unsteady rise of his shoulders, on the terrible effort in the shape of his body. By the time she reached him, breathless and shaking, one truth had become impossible to deny. This was no longer about anger. This was about whether she could still reach the man inside the storm before the storm reached him first. Lucian lifted his head when she reached him. The sight of his face in the storm nearly broke her. His eyes were no longer grey at all. They burned silver, bright and wild, with none of the calm control she had grown used to. Rain ran down his face, but it did not soften him. It only made the strange light beneath his skin easier to see. It traced his throat and climbed along one side of his jaw in thin, pale lines. Like something inside him had grown too strong to stay hidden. "Go back," he said. The words came out rough, each one forced through strain. Tessa dropped to her knees in the wet grass in front of him, uncaring that mud soaked through her coat. "No." His hand pressed harder into the ground. The muscles in his neck tightened. "Tessa, no." Wind tore past them, dragging her hair across her face. She pushed it aside with shaking fingers and held his gaze, even though the sight of him unsettled every part of her. "You do not know what I am right now," he said. That line should have frightened her into retreat. Instead, it sharpened something inside her. "Yes," she said, voice unsteady but clear. "I do." He stared at her, as if he could not believe the answer. Tessa reached for him slowly this time, giving him every chance to pull away. When her hands touched his face, the shock ran through her again, cold first, then a deep rising heat beneath the surface. His eyes closed for one brief second, not in peace, but in struggle. Rain ran down both their faces. "You are not the worst thing that has ever happened to you," she said. "You are not only this storm. You are not only what frightens you." His breathing turned ragged. Tessa moved closer, refusing to let the wind steal the words before they reached him. "So tell me the truth, Lucian. Right now, in this moment, what are you fighting harder, the thing inside you, or the part of you that still believes no one would stay once they saw all of it?" And in the silence that followed, with the sea crashing below and the storm closing around them, Tessa knew the answer to that question would decide far more than this night. For one terrible second, Lucian did not answer. The wind roared past them, dragging rain sideways across the cliff lawn, flattening the grass around their knees. Tessa kept her hands on his face, even as her fingers trembled from cold and fear. Beneath her palms, his skin carried that same impossible contrast, cold at the surface, heat moving under it, like his body could not decide which world it belonged to anymore. Then his shoulders shook, not from the storm, from effort. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded lower than before, thinner in a way that hurt to hear. Both. The word tore through her, not because it surprised her, because it confirmed what she had already begun to understand. Lucian was not only fighting the strange force inside him, he was fighting the part of himself that still believed he was safest when feared, safest when distant, safest when alone. Even now, with his control slipping under her hands, he still wanted to send her away before she could choose him freely. Tessa leaned closer, forcing him to keep looking at her. "Then listen to me," she said, rain catching in her lashes. "You do not get to decide for me every time fear speaks first." Something changed in his expression at that. Not a full return, not relief, but the silver in his eyes shifted. Just enough for grey to begin pressing back through the center, thin as dawn at the edge of a long night. His breathing stayed uneven. His jaw remained tight. Still, the wildness in him faltered for one fragile moment. The wind broke around them. It did not stop. It bent. Lucian's hand lifted slowly from the ground and caught at her wrist, not to push her away, but to hold on to something steady. His grip was careful despite the strain in him, and that care nearly undid her. Even here, even now, some part of him was still fighting to remain gentle. Then his body sagged, not fully, not into collapse. Enough to tell her the struggle had cost him more than he could hide. Behind them, through the sheets of rain, Tessa could just make out Maeve at the terrace steps. Watching, waiting, not interfering. Lucian lowered his forehead until it nearly touched hers. His eyes shut once, hard, as if he were pulling himself back through pain one thread at a time. When he opened them again, there was more grey than silver. But before Tessa could believe the worst had passed, Lucian whispered something against the storm that made the cold inside her deepen all over again. This will not be the last time. And kneeling there at the cliff edge with his hands still locked around her wrist, Tessa understood that bringing him back tonight had not ended anything. It had only shown her how much more there was to lose. The morning after the storm did not feel like victory. It felt quiet in the way a house turns quiet after something has nearly been lost. Tessa woke late, not because she had slept deeply, but because exhaustion had finally taken her without asking. When she opened her eyes, pale sunlight had replaced the violence of the night. The curtains stirred gently in the breeze coming through the narrow gap of the window. Beyond the glass, the sea looked almost innocent, bright and calm under a washed blue sky, as if it had not roared like a living thing only hours earlier. For a few still seconds, she lay there, trying to separate dream from memory. Then she saw the dried mud on her boots by the chair, the coat hanging damp near the wardrobe, the faint ache in her knees from the cliff grass, and Lucian's voice returned at once. "This will not be the last time." Tessa sat up slowly. There was no tray outside her door that morning, no note, no measured sign that the house had resumed its usual order. That unsettled her more than noise would have. Vale House had always moved with rhythm. Tea at the same hour, footsteps where they belonged, silence that felt shaped, not accidental. Today the rhythm was missing, and in its place sat a strange pause, as if everyone inside the house was waiting to see what shape the day would take. She dressed quickly and opened the door. The corridor stood empty, washed in soft morning light. Far below, somewhere near the back of the house, she heard the quiet clink of dishes. Nothing else. No piano, no footsteps, no low voices, no sign of Lucian. By the time she reached the breakfast room, Maeve was there alone, setting down a pot of tea with her usual care. Yet even Maeve looked altered, not frightened, not shaken, more guarded than before, as if the storm had confirmed something she had long expected. "Where is he?" Tessa asked. Maeve met her eyes for one measured second. Resting, that should have eased her. It did not, because in Maeve's voice, Tessa heard the truth before it was spoken aloud. Lucian had survived the night, but some nights leave marks that daylight does not erase. Tessa sat down, but she did not reach for the tea right away. Maeve poured it in silence, set the cup near her hand, and moved back toward the sideboard with the same quiet precision she always carried. Yet the room felt changed, not broken. tender in a way that made every sound matter more. The spoon touching the saucer, the soft steam lifting from the pot, the gulls outside, faint through the glass. After the storm, even small things seemed to speak more clearly. Tessa knew that feeling. Some nights in life did not end when morning came. They stayed in the body, in the joints, in the chest, in the way a person reached for a cup or stood a little too still in a doorway. She had seen it after hospital calls that ran too long, after hard days at the bookstore when grief hit without warning, after the final weeks of her mother's illness when every sunrise felt less like relief and more like proof that pain could continue with perfect calm. That was what this morning felt like. Not drama, aftermath. She wrapped both hands around the cup at last and looked toward the rain-clean windows. Did he sleep? A little, Maeve said. Is he hurt? Maeve considered the word before answering. Not in the ways you mean. That answer stayed with Tessa, because she understood it too well. A person did not need blood or bruises to be carrying damage. Some injuries lived in pride, some in memory, some in the terrible effort it took to keep returning to yourself after nearly losing the way. She thought of Lucian at the cliff edge, silver-eyed and shaking under her hands, still trying to send her away while falling apart in front of her. Even now, the memory cut in two directions at once. Part of her remained hurt by what he had hidden. Another part could not stop seeing the force of his fear, not fear of pain, but fear of becoming someone who could no longer choose restraint. That was the part she related to most, not the mystery of him. The exhaustion, the cost of fighting every day to remain the version of yourself you can still respect. Lucian did not come to breakfast. He did not appear at midday either. By early afternoon, the absence had become its own presence in the house. Tessa felt it, in every room she crossed. In the library, where one book still lay open near the chair he favored by the window. In the conservatory, where yesterday's light still seemed trapped in the glass. In the corridor outside the music room, where silence now felt less peaceful and more deliberate, as if the house itself had agreed to give him space. She tried to read. She failed. She tried writing Nolan a proper message. She ended with 3 short lines about the sea and the weather, none of which said anything true about the shape of her day. By 2 o'clock, restlessness had pushed her into the west corridor, the one section of the house she had always felt rather than known. The locked part, the hidden part, the side Maeve's rules had named before trust existed. Lucian stood there when she turned the corner. He was near the tall window at the end of the passage, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly against the wall. He looked steadier than he had at dawn, but not fully restored. There was a drawn quality to him, as though the night had taken more strength than daylight could return in a few hours. His face held the same controlled calm as always, yet something in it was softer now, not weak, not open, simply stripped of pretense. "Tessa," he said. The sound of her name in his voice carried a quiet weight. She stopped a few steps away. "Maeve said you were resting." "I was. That is not the same as being well." A faint shift touched his mouth, not a full smile. Still, it stayed long enough to make the corridor feel less cold. "No," he said. "It is not." His gaze moved to the old brass key in his hand, then back to her. "There is something I should have shown you sooner," he said. Without another word, he turned toward the locked door at the far end of the corridor, and for the first time since her arrival at Vale House, Tessa understood that some truths were not told first with words. They were revealed by the rooms people kept closed. Lucian unlocked the West Tower door with a slow turn of the brass key, then stepped aside to let Tessa enter first. The room beyond was not what she expected. For all the warning wrapped around that part of the house, she had imagined something severe. A locked study, old records, perhaps evidence of the life Lucian had spent years keeping from the world. Instead, the space carried a stillness so tender it forced her to stop in the doorway. It was a nursery, soft blue walls, faded with time, a painted moon in one corner, a wooden horse near the window, shelves lined with worn children's books whose colors had gone gentle with age. A narrow bed stood beneath a quilt stitched by hand, its pattern small and careful, as if love had once been folded into every square. Dust had been kept away. Nothing was ruined. Nothing abandoned. The room had not been forgotten. It had been preserved. Tessa turned slowly, taking it in, the untouched order of it, the ache in the quiet. This was your sister's room. Lucien remained near the door, one hand still resting on the key, as though some part of him had not yet crossed fully inside. Yes, he did not say her name. He did not need to. The grief in that single word filled the rest of the distance. Tessa stepped farther in, eyes catching on a small hair ribbon folded beside the books, a glass dish holding smooth stones, a child's drawing pinned behind the frame of a mirror, tiny things, ordinary things, the kind that only become sacred after time takes the person who first touched them. She lived, Lucien said quietly behind her. She married, had children, grew old. I remained the same. Tessa closed her eyes for one brief second, because now she understood. This room was not only memory, it was proof. Proof of the years he had watched pass over everyone he loved while his own face refused to change. Proof that survival, stretched long enough, could turn into isolation wearing the shape of endurance. She turned back toward him. And you kept this room exactly as it was? Lucien's gaze moved across the nursery without settling in one place. At first, I told myself I was protecting a memory. Later, I understood I was preserving the last room in this house where love had not yet learned to leave. The words landed softly. That made them hurt more. For a while, neither of them spoke. Tessa stood near the small bed with her fingers resting lightly on the carved wooden rail, while Lucien remained by the door, as if he still did not trust himself to stand too close to the center of the room. The late afternoon light entered through the narrow tower window in a pale band, touching the faded quilt, the painted moon, the books left in perfect order. Nothing in the nursery felt grand. That was what made it devastating. It was a room built for a child who was loved, kept alive by a man who had lost the years that child went on to live. Tessa looked at him. You kept distance because you thought it was mercy. Lucien gave a slow nod. At first, yes. And later? A tired breath left him. Later, it became habit, then punishment, then the only life I knew how to trust. The answer settled between them with quiet force. Tessa crossed a little closer, not all the way, only enough to narrow the space. That is not the same as living. No, he said. His eyes stayed on her now, steady and unguarded in a way they rarely were. It is not. The room seemed to draw tighter around that truth. Outside, a gull cried over the cliffs. Far below, the sea moved against rock with a softer rhythm than the night before. Inside the tower, every small sound felt distant compared to the silence. Growing between them, not empty silence, but the kind shaped by words still waiting to be spoken. Lucien's gaze dropped briefly to her hand on the bedrail, then rose again to her face. I brought you here, he said, voice low, because this is the last place in the house where I can still remember who I was before fear taught me to live alone. Tessa did not move. His next words came even quieter. And because if I did not tell you now, I would be doing what I have done too often already. Hiding the truth until it arrives too late. Her pulse turned hard and uneven. Lucien took one careful step closer. I have wanted you since the first day you challenged me at my own table, he said. I tried to make space between us. I failed. Tessa felt the room tilt inside her chest. Because the truth she had spent days fighting rose at once to meet his, and standing in the nursery of a lost past, with evening light falling across the floor between them, she understood that what came next would ask for an answer she could no longer hide from. Tessa did not answer him with words. For one suspended moment, she only stood there in the nursery, with her heart beating so hard it felt louder than the sea below the cliffs. Evening light slanted through the tower window and fell across the faded quilt, the painted moon, the old books lined in quiet order. The room held memory in every corner, but the truth between them belonged to the present now, bare and impossible to push aside. Lucien took no further step. That mattered. He did not close the distance as if confession had earned him anything. He simply stood there, with the kind of stillness that comes after a man has said the one thing he can no longer survive hiding. His face had none of its usual shield. No polished calm, no careful distance, only honesty and the strain of waiting to see what honesty would cost. Tessa looked at him and saw everything at once. The man in the library with silver eyes and pain caught in his breath. The man in the conservatory telling the truth in pieces because whole truth had become too heavy to lift all at once. The man at the cliff edge fighting not only the force inside him, but the old belief that he was safest when feared. The man who had preserved his sister's room because love, once lost, was the only thing he had not known how to bury. And beneath all of that, she saw something simpler. A man who wanted without demanding. A man who cared without knowing how to ask cleanly for care in return. A man who had spent too many years surviving and too few years being held by anything gentle. Tessa crossed the remaining distance slowly. Lucien's breath caught, though he did not move away and did not reach first. Even now he gave her room to choose. That quiet restraint touched her more deeply than any grand declaration could have done. She lifted one hand and rested it against his face. His eyes closed for a second, not in pain this time, but in relief so raw it nearly undid her. When he opened them again, Tessa rose onto her toes and kissed him. It was not rushed, not wild, not careless. It was soft, slow, and full of everything they had tried to hold back. The kiss ended gently, but the feeling of it stayed between them. Tessa lowered her hand from Lucien's face and searched his eyes, as if she needed to make sure the moment had not come from grief, weakness, or the fragile aftermath of the storm. What she found there was not hunger, not triumph, not relief alone. It was gratitude so quiet, it hurt. That was what touched her most, not the closeness itself, the care inside it. For so long, love in Tessa's life had been tied to duty. She had loved her mother through illness, loved Nolan through worry, loved the bookstore through debt and fading hope. Her love had become practical, steady, useful. It showed up in paid bills, warm meals, and promises kept when no one saw how much those promises cost. Even her tenderness had learned to wear work clothes. Lucien changed that, not because he made life easy. He did not. Not because he arrived without history. He carried more of it than anyone she had ever known. He changed it because, with him, she felt something she had nearly forgotten how to receive. Care that noticed her. Attention that did not ask her to be strong first. A quiet kind of love that did not rush to own, fix, or control. That was why the moment in the nursery felt so different from fantasy. It felt earned. Tessa thought of the first night in the library, of fear hitting her like cold water, of every strange turn after that, the conservatory, the cliff path, the kitchen in candlelight, the storm, the grief wrapped inside this room. None of it had been simple. That mattered too. What stood between her and Lucien had not grown out of perfect circumstances. It had grown through truth, injury, restraint, and the painful work of staying. She drew a slow breath and let herself speak plainly. "I was trying not to feel this," she said. A faint, tired warmth touched Lucien's mouth. "You were not alone in that effort." Tessa gave a small laugh, soft enough not to disturb the room around them. Then her expression gentled again. "I think that is why it became impossible," she said. "Because it was never only attraction. It was the way you listened, the way you held back when you could have taken more, the way you kept choosing gentleness even when life gave you every reason not to." They stayed in the tower room a little longer, not speaking much after that, because some moments lose strength when too many words are laid over them. Lucien stood close, one hand lightly resting at her waist, as if even now he was still learning the shape of permission. Tessa did not step away. She leaned into the quiet instead, into the rare peace of being near someone who had stopped hiding at the exact moment she had stopped pretending. When they finally left the nursery, evening had deepened across the house. Maeve was in the dining room setting out supper by candlelight, though the electricity had long since returned. Tessa noticed the choice at once. Softer light, more warmth, less distance. Maeve looked up as they entered, and though her face stayed composed, something knowing passed through her eyes before she turned back to the table. Neither she nor Lucien explained anything. They did not need to. Dinner moved with a new kind of silence, gentler than before. Lucien still ate little, though he made an effort with the broth Maeve served. Tessa noticed him watching her once or twice with the same careful expression he had worn in the tower, as if he still had trouble trusting that what had happened upstairs belonged to real life and not to a brief mercy that would vanish by morning. After supper, they went to the library. Rain had stopped. The windows reflected only the room now, shelves, lamps, firelight, and for the first time since Tessa arrived, Lucian's image appeared whole in the old glass. She saw it before he did. Her breath caught softly. Lucian turned, following her gaze. For 1 second, he simply stared at the mirror, not with vanity, not even with surprise, with something far more painful, recognition mixed with quiet grief, as if a part of him he had not expected to recover had returned without warning. Tessa moved closer. "You're there." His eyes stayed on the reflection. "Yes." The word came out almost broken. She looked from the mirror to his face. What changed? Lucian turned toward her slowly, the fire catching in his grey eyes. "You stayed." That answer settled deep, because the real shift in Vale House was no longer only his control, or the storm passing, or the fragile peace after confession. It was this. A man who had spent years fading from his own life was beginning, piece by piece, to return to it. The next morning arrived clear, almost gentle, as if the house itself had decided not to disturb what the night had finally made plain. Tessa stood on the east terrace with a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching pale sunlight spread across the sea. The cliffs below were still wet from the storm, their dark edges shining where the light touched them. For the first time since she had arrived at Vale House, the place did not feel suspended between danger and silence. It felt awake. She heard Lucian before she saw him. His footsteps were quiet, but no longer distant in the way they had once been. He stepped beside her, dressed simply, one hand in his pocket, the morning breeze moving lightly through his hair. There was still tiredness in him, but not the hollow strain she had seen after harder nights. He looked steadier, more present. "The car is ready whenever you want it," he said. Tessa turned to him at once. There it was again, that old habit, offering distance before desire, freedom before hope, escape before asking for anything that might matter too much. She set her cup down on the stone rail. "Do you want me to go?" she asked. Lucian held her gaze. "No." "Then why do you keep offering me an exit like love is something I need protection from?" A quiet stillness settled between them. Lucian looked out over the sea before answering, "Because wanting someone has never felt dangerous only for me. It changes their life too." Tessa studied his face. "That is true, but so does fear, so does silence, so does deciding for other people what they can survive." That reached him. She saw it. He looked back at her, calm, honest, no shield left. "I am trying not to repeat what I have done before." "And what is that?" he answered without turning away, calling distance mercy when it is only fear in better clothing. The line landed with clean force. Tessa stepped closer, close enough to see the full reflection of the morning in his eyes. "Then answer me truthfully, Lucian. After everything, after the storm, after the tower, after last night, what do you believe I really saw when I looked at you? If you believe real love begins when truth is finally spoken, like this video, subscribe to Romance Tales with Mr. Kingsley and share this story with someone who still believes love heals what fear tries to bury. And in the silence that followed, the question no longer belonged to mystery. It belonged to love, and whether he could finally bear to name himself as someone still worthy of it. Lucian did not answer at once. He stood before her in the morning light with the sea behind him and the old habit of distance still lingering in his face, though weaker now, like a door left open too long to close fully again. Tessa watched the question settle into him, not as pressure, as truth, the kind he had spent years avoiding because naming it would force him to live inside it. At last, he spoke. "I thought you saw a man marked by something unnatural," he said quietly. "A life too strange to trust, a burden no one should share." Tessa shook her head once. "That is what you feared I saw," she said. "It is not what I saw." Lucian's gaze stayed fixed on hers. Tessa stepped closer until only a breath of space remained between them. "I saw a man who feels deeply and hides it badly. A man who protects people without asking to be thanked. A man who punishes himself faster than life ever needed to. A man who spent too long believing pain was the truest thing about him. The wind moved softly around them. Far below, the sea struck the cliffs with a calmer rhythm than before. "You are strange," she went on, her voice warm and steady. "That part is true. Your life is not simple. That part is true too. But none of that makes you less worthy of love. It only means love had to work harder to reach you." Something in Lucien's face gave way then. Not weakness, not grief alone, but the deep quiet of a man hearing mercy in a voice he trusts. Tessa took his hand. "I came here for money," she said. "I stayed because you frightened me. Then I stayed because I wanted the truth. Now I stay because I know what you really are." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "And what is that?" She smiled, small and certain. "A man I want a future with." His breath left him slowly, like a weight finally setting itself down. Tessa looked toward the line where sea met sky, then back at him. "So here is my answer. When these 30 days end, I am not walking away from you. You are coming with me to save a bookstore." The faintest real laugh touched his mouth. "A bookstore. With a reading room upstairs," she said, "for tired hearts." Lucien looked at her, as if the life she had placed before him was harder to believe than any storm. Then he brought her hand to his lips and held it there for one quiet second. And standing on the terrace above the sea, with morning opening wide around them, Tessa knew the deepest truth of all. She had agreed to stay for 30 days. What she found was a man worth staying for long after the days were done.